Ziggy, let there be darkness. Ziggy, turn the 7th light on.
Okay.
Ziggy, turn 6th light on white.
You got it. The 6th light is now on and set to white.
Ziggy, turn the living room light on.
Done.
Ziggy, turn the living room light off.
Got it.
Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Proverbs, chapter 3. My son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. It shall be health to thy navel, and marrow to thy bones. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the firstfruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. Understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is every one that retaineth her. The Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth, by understanding hath he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken up, and the clouds drop down the... My son, let not them depart from thine eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. So shall they be life unto thy soul, and grace to thy neck. Then shalt thou walk in thy way safely, and thy foot shall not stumble. liest down, thou shalt not be afraid. Yea, thou shalt lie down, and thy sleep shall be sweet. Be not afraid of sudden fear, neither of the desolation of the wicked when it cometh. For the Lord shall be thy confidence, and shall keep thy foot from being taken. Withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Say not unto thy neighbor, Go and come again, and tomorrow I will give, when thou hast it by thee. Devise not evil against thy neighbor, seeing he dwelleth securely by thee. Strive not with a man without cause, if he have done thee no harm. Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. For the froward is abomination to the Lord, but his secret is with the righteous. The curse of the Lord is in the house of the wicked, but he blesseth the habitation of the just. Surely he scorneth the scorners, but he giveth grace unto the lowly. The wise shall inherit the glory, but shame shall be the promotion of fools. Proverbs chapter 4. Hear, ye children, the instruction of a father, and attend to no understanding. For I give you good doctrine, forsake ye not my law. For I was my father's son, tender and only beloved in the sight of my mother. He taught me also and said unto me, Let thine heart retain my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Forget it not, neither decline from the words of my mouth. Forsake her not, and she shall preserve thee. Love her, and she shall keep thee. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. Exalt her, and she shall promote thee. She shall bring thee to honor when thou dost embrace her. She shall give to thine head an ornament of grace. A crown of glory shall she deliver to thee. Hear, O my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of thy life shall be many. I have taught thee in the way of wisdom. I have led thee in right paths. When thou goest, thy steps shall not be straitened, and when thou runnest, thou shalt not stumble. Take fast hold of instruction. Let her not go. Keep her, for she is thy life. Enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. For they sleep not, except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away, lest they cause some to fall. For they eat the bread of wickedness, and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the just is as the shining light, that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. My son, attend to my words. Incline thine ear unto my sayings. Let them not depart from thine eyes. Keep them in the midst of thine heart. For they are life unto those that find them, and health to all their flesh. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left. Remove thy foot from evil. Proverbs chapter 5. My son, attend unto my wisdom, and bow thine ear to my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and that thy lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house, lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined mine ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not thy strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquities shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sins. He shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. Proverbs, chapter 6. My son, if thou be surety for thy friend, if thou hast stricken thy hand with a stranger, thou art snared with the words of thy mouth, thou art taken with the words of thy mouth. Do this now, my son, and deliver thyself, when thou art come into the hand of thy friend. Go, humble thyself, and make sure thy friend. Give not sleep to thine eyes, nor slumber to thine eyelids. Deliver thyself as a roe from the hand of the hunter, and as a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travelleth, and thy want as an armed man. A naughty person, a wicked man, walketh with a froward mouth. He winketh with his eyes, he speaketh with his feet, he teacheth with his fingers. Frowardness is in his heart. He deviseth mischief continually, he soweth discord. Therefore shall his calamity come suddenly, suddenly shall he be broken without remedy. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him: a proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, an heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. My son, keep thy father's commandment, and forsake not the law of thy mother. Bind them continually upon thine heart, and tie them about thy neck. When thou goest, it shall lead thee. When thou sleepest, it shall keep thee. And when thou awakest, it shall talk with thee. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life. To keep thee from the evil woman, from the flattery of the tongue of a strange woman. Lust not after her beauty in thine heart, neither let her take thee with her eyelids. For by means of a whorish woman a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. Can a man take fire in his bosom, and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals, and his feet not be burned? So he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her shall not be innocent. Men do not despise a thief, if he steal to satisfy his soul when he is hungry. But if he be found, he shall restore 7-fold, he shall give all the substance of his house. But whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. He that doeth it destroyeth his own soul. A wound and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall not be wiped away. For jealousy is the rage of a man, therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will not regard any ransom, neither will he rest content, though thou givest many gifts. Proverbs, chapter 7. My son, keep my words, and lay up my commandments with thee. Keep my commandments and live, and my law as the apple of thine eye. Bind them upon thy fingers, write them upon the table of thine heart. Say unto wisdom, Thou art my sister, and call understanding thy kinswoman, that they may keep thee from the strange woman, from the stranger which flattereth with her words. For at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and beheld among the simple ones, I discerned among the youths, a young man, void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner, and he went the way to keep her house, in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. And behold, there met him a woman with the attire of an harlot, and subtle of heart. She is loud and stubborn, her feet abide not in her house. Now she is without, now in the streets, and lieth in wait at every corner. So she caught him and kissed him, and with an impudent face said unto him, I have peace offerings with me. This day have I paid my vows. Therefore came I forth to meet thee, diligently to seek thy face, and I have found thee. I have decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, with carved works, with fine linen of Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves with loves. For the good man is not at home, he is gone a long journey. He hath taken a bag of money with him, and will come home at the day appointed. With her much fair speech she caused him to yield. With the flattering of her lips she forced him. He goeth after her straightway, as an ox goeth to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks. Till a dart strike through his liver, as a bird hasteth to the snare, and knoweth not that it is for his life. Hearken unto me now, therefore, O ye children, and attend to the words of my mouth. Let not thine heart decline to her ways, nor go astray in her paths. For she hath cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Proverbs, chapter 8. Doth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? She standeth in the top of high places, by the way in the places of the paths. She crieth at the gates, at the entry of the city, at the coming in at the doors. Unto you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of man. O ye simple, understand wisdom, and ye fools, be ye of an understanding heart. Hear, for I will speak of excellent things, and the opening of my lips shall be right things. For my mouth shall speak truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the words of my mouth are in righteousness, there is nothing froward or perverse in them. They are all plain to him that understandeth, and right to them that find knowledge. Receive my instruction, and not silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and find out knowledge of witty inventions. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding, I have strength. By me kings reign, and princes decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. Riches and honor are with me, yea, durable riches and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, yea, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I lead in the way of righteousness, in the midst of the paths of judgment, that I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, and I will fill their treasures. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth. When he established the clouds above. When he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he gave to the sea his decree that the waters should not pass his commandment. When he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. Now therefore hearken unto me, O ye children, for blessed are they that keep my ways. Hear instruction, and be wise, and refuse it not. Blessed is the man that heareth me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. For whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favor of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. Proverbs, chapter 9. Wisdom hath builded her house. She hath hewn out her 7 pillars. She hath killed her beasts. She hath mingled her wine. She hath also furnished her table. She hath sent forth her maidens. She crieth upon the highest places of the city. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. As for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, Come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine which I have mingled. Forsake the foolish, and live, and go in the way of understanding. He that reproveth a scorner getteth to himself shame, and he that rebuketh a wicked man getteth himself a blot. Reprove not a scorner, lest he hate thee. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. For by me thy days shall be multiplied, and the years of thy life shall be increased. If thou be wise, thou shalt be wise for thyself. But if thou scornest, thou alone shalt bear it. A foolish woman is clamorous, she is simple and knoweth nothing, for she sitteth at the door of her house on a seat in the high places of the city, to call passengers who go right on their ways. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. And as for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, Stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he knoweth not that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of hell. Proverbs, chapter 10. The Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivereth from death. The Lord will not suffer the soul of the righteous to famish, but he casteth away the substance of the wicked. He becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent maketh rich. He that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame. Blessings are upon the head of the just, but violence covereth the mouth of the wicked. The memory of the just is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. The wise in heart will receive commandments, but a prating fool shall fall. He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known. He that winketh with the eye causeth sorrow, but a prating fool shall fall. The mouth of a righteous man is a well of life, but violence covereth the mouth of the wicked. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. In the lips of him that hath understanding wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. Wise men lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, the destruction of the poor is their poverty. The labor of the righteous tendeth to life, the fruit of the wicked to sin. He is in the way of life that keepeth instruction, but he that refuseth reproof erreth. He that hideth hatred with lying lips, and he that uttereth a slander is a fool. In the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. The tongue of the just is as choice silver, the heart of the wicked is little worth. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for want of wisdom. The blessing of the Lord it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it. It is as sport to a fool to do mischief, but a man of understanding hath wisdom. The fear of the wicked it shall come upon him, but the desire of the righteous shall be granted. As the whirlwind passeth, so is the wicked no more, but the righteous is an everlasting foundation. As vinegar to the teeth, and as smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to them that send him. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. The hope of the righteous shall be gladness, but the expectation of the wicked shall perish. The way of the Lord is strength to the upright, but destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. The righteous shall never be removed, but the wicked shall not inhabit the earth. The mouth of the just bringeth forth wisdom, but the froward tongue shall be cut out. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked speaketh frowardness. Proverbs, chapter 11. A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. When pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. The integrity of the upright shall guide them, but the perverseness of transgressors shall destroy them. Riches profit not in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivereth from death. The righteousness of the perfect shall direct his way, but the wicked shall fall by his own wickedness. The righteousness of the upright shall deliver them, but transgressors shall be taken in their own naughtiness. When a wicked man dieth, his expectation shall perish, and the hope of unjust men perisheth. The righteous is delivered out of trouble, and the wicked cometh in his stead. An hypocrite with his mouth destroyeth his neighbor, but through knowledge shall the just be delivered. When it goeth well with the righteous, the city rejoiceth, and when the wicked perish, there is shouting. By the blessing of the upright the city is exalted, but it is overthrown by the mouth of the wicked. He that is void of wisdom despiseth his neighbor, but a man of understanding holdeth his peace. A talebearer revealeth secrets, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. He that is surety for a stranger shall smart for it, and he that hateth suretyship is sure. A gracious woman retaineth honor, and strong men retain riches. The merciful man doeth good to his own soul, but he that is cruel troubleth his own flesh. The wicked worketh a deceitful work, but to him that soweth righteousness shall be a sure reward. As righteousness tendeth to life, so he that pursueth evil pursueth it to his own death. They that are of a froward heart are abomination to the Lord, but such as are upright in their way are his delight. Though hand join in hand, the wicked shall not be unpunished, but the seed of the righteous shall be delivered. As a jewel of gold in a swine's snout, so is a fair woman which is without discretion. The desire of the righteous is only good, but the expectation of the wicked is wrath. There is that scattereth, and yet increaseth, and there is that withholdeth more than is meet, but it tendeth to poverty. The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself. He that withholdeth corn, the people shall curse him, but blessing shall be upon the head of him that selleth it. He that diligently seeketh good procureth favor, but he that seeketh mischief, it shall come unto him. He that trusteth in his riches shall fall, but the righteous shall flourish as a branch. He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind, and the fool shall be servant to the wise of heart. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. Behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. Proverbs, chapter 12. Whoso loveth instruction loveth knowledge, but he that hateth reproof is brutish. A good man obtaineth favor of the Lord, but a man of wicked devices will he condemn. A man shall not be established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous shall not be moved. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. The thoughts of the righteous are right, but the counsels of the wicked are deceit. The words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. The wicked are overthrown and are not, but the house of the righteous shall stand. A man shall be commended according to his wisdom, but he that is of a perverse heart shall be despised. He that is despised and hath a servant is better than he that honoreth himself and lacketh bread. A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. He that tilleth his land shall be satisfied with bread, but he that followeth vain persons is void of understanding. The wicked desireth the net of evil men, but the root of the righteous yieldeth fruit. The wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. A man shall be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hands shall be rendered unto him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. A fool's wrath is presently known, but a prudent man covereth shame. He that speaketh truth showeth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. A prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute. Heaviness in the heart of man maketh it stoop, but a good word maketh it glad. The righteous is more excellent than his neighbor, but the way of the wicked seduceth. The way of the wicked seduceth them. The slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting, but the substance of a diligent man is precious. In the way of righteousness is life, and in the pathway thereof there is no death. Proverbs chapter 13. A wise son heareth his father's instruction, but a scorner heareth not rebuke. A man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. He that keepeth his mouth keepeth his life, but he that openeth wide his lips shall have destruction. The soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. A righteous man hateth lying, but a wicked man is loathsome, and cometh to shame. Righteousness keepeth him that is upright in the way, but wickedness overthroweth the sinner. There is that maketh himself rich, yet hath nothing. There is that maketh himself poor, yet hath great riches. The ransom of a man's life are his riches, but the poor heareth not rebuke. The light of the righteous rejoiceth, but the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, but when the desire cometh, it is a tree of life. Whoso despiseth the word shall be destroyed, but he that feareth the commandment shall be rewarded. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Good understanding giveth favor, but the way of transgressors is hard. Every prudent man dealeth with knowledge, but a fool layeth open his folly. A wicked messenger falleth into mischief, but a faithful ambassador is health. Poverty and shame shall be to him that refuseth instruction, but he that regardeth reproof shall be honored. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is abomination to fools to depart from evil. He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Evil pursueth sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. A good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. Much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. The righteous eateth to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. Proverbs chapter 14. Every wise woman buildeth her house, but the foolish plucketh it down with her hands. He that walketh in his uprightness feareth the Lord, but he that is perverse in his ways despiseth him. In the mouth of the foolish is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise shall preserve them. Where no oxen are, the crib is clean, but much increase is by the strength of the ox. A faithful witness will not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. A scorner seeketh wisdom and findeth it not, but knowledge is easy unto him that understandeth. Go from the presence of a foolish man, when thou perceivest not in him the lips of knowledge. The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. Fools make a mock at sin, but among the righteous there is favor. The heart knoweth his own bitterness, and a stranger doth not intermeddle with his joy. The house of the wicked shall be overthrown, but the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. The backslider in heart shall be filled with his own ways, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself. The simple believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his going. A wise man feareth and departeth from evil, but the fool rageth and is confident. He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The evil bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The poor is hated even of his own neighbor, but the rich hath many friends. He that despiseth his neighbor sinneth, but he that hath mercy on the poor, happy is he. Do they not err that devise evil? But mercy and truth shall be to them that devise good. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. The crown of the wise is their riches, but the foolishness of fools is folly. A true witness delivereth souls, but a deceitful witness speaketh lies. In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. In the multitude of people is the king's honor, but in the want of people is the destruction of the prince. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy the rottenness of the bones. He that oppresseth the poor reproacheth his Maker, but he that honoreth him hath mercy on the poor. The wicked is driven away in his wickedness, but the righteous hath hope in his death. Wisdom resteth in the heart of him that hath understanding, but that which is in the midst of fools is made known. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. The king's favor is toward a wise servant, but his wrath is against him that causeth shame. Proverbs, chapter 15. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. A fool despiseth his father's instruction, but he that regardeth reproof is prudent. In the house of the righteous is much treasure, but in the revenues of the wicked is trouble. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. The way of the wicked is an abomination unto the Lord, but he loveth him that followeth after righteousness. Correction is grievous unto him that forsaketh the way, and he that hateth reproof shall die. Hell and destruction are before the Lord. How much more then the hearts of the children of men? A scorner loveth not one that reproveth him, neither will he go unto the wise. A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart the spirit is broken. The heart of him that hath understanding seeketh knowledge, but the mouth of fools feedeth on foolishness. All the days of the afflicted are evil, but he that is of a merry heart hath a continual feast. Better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife. The way of the slothful man is an hedge of thorns, but the way of the righteous is made plain. A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish man despiseth his mother. Folly is joy to him that is destitute of wisdom, but a man of understanding walketh uprightly. Without counsel purposes are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors they are established. A man hath joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good is it? The way of life is above to the wise, that he may depart from hell beneath. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. He that is greedy of gain troubleth his own house, but he that hateth gifts shall live. The heart of the righteous studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he heareth the prayer of the righteous. The light of the eyes rejoiceth the heart, and a good report maketh the bones fat. The ear that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuseth instruction despiseth his own soul, but he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Proverbs, chapter 16. The preparations of the heart of man, and the answer of the tongue, is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weigheth the spirits. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. The Lord hath made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. Every one that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. By mercy and truth iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king, his mouth transgresseth not in judgment. A just weight and balance are the Lord's, all the weights of the bag are his work. It is an abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him that speaketh right. The wrath of a king is as messengers of death, but a wise man will pacify it. In the light of the king's countenance is life, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather to be chosen than silver? The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He that keepeth his way preserveth his soul. Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Better it is to be of an humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. He that handleth the matter wisely shall find good, and whoso trusteth in the Lord, happy is he. The wise in heart shall be called prudent, and the sweetness of the lips increaseth learning. Understanding is a wellspring of life unto him that hath it, but the instruction of fools is folly. The heart of the wise teacheth his mouth, and addeth learning to his lips. Pleasant words are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul, and health to the bones. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. He that laboureth, laboureth for himself, for his mouth craveth it of him. An ungodly man diggeth up evil, and in his lips there is as a burning fire. A froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer separateth chief friends. A violent man enticeth his neighbor, and leadeth him into the way that is not good. He shutteth his eyes to devise froward things. Moving his lips, he bringeth evil to pass.
This is Audible. Psychology of the Unconscious. A study of the transformations and symbolisms of the libido. A contribution to the history of the evolution of thought by Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. Translated by Beatrice M. Hinkle, MD. Read by Martin Swain for Ukemi Audiobooks. Translator's note. That humanity is seeking a new message, a new light upon the meaning of life, and something tangible, as it were, with which it can work towards a larger understanding of itself and its relation to the universe, is a fact I think none will gainsay. Therefore, it has seemed to me particularly timely to introduce to the English-speaking world Dr. Jung's remarkable book, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. In this work he has plunged boldly into the treacherous sea of mythology and folklore, the productions of the ancient mind and that of the common people, and turned upon this vast material the same scientific and painstaking method of psychologic analysis that is applied to the modern mind, in order to reveal the common bond of desire and longing which unites all humanity, and thus bridge the gaps presumed to exist between ancient and widely separated peoples and those of our modern time. The discovery of this undercurrent affecting and influencing ancient peoples as well as modern serves as a foundation or platform from which he proceeds to hold aloft a new ideal, a new goal of attainment possible of achievement and which can be intellectually satisfying as well as emotionally appealing, the goal of moral autonomy. This book, remarkable for its erudition and the tremendous labor expended upon it, as well as for the new light which it sheds upon human life, its motives, its needs, and its possibilities, is not one for desultory reading or superficial examination. Such an approach will prevent the reader from gaining anything of its real value. But for those who can bring a serious interest and willingness to give a careful study to it, the work will prove to be a veritable mine capable of yielding the greatest riches. Beatrice Hinkle, New York, 1915. Therefore, theory, which gives to facts their value and significance, is often very useful, even if it is partially false, for it throws light on phenomena which no one observed. It forces an examination from many angles of facts which no one had hitherto studied, and it gives the impulse for more extended and more productive researches. It is, therefore, a moral duty for the man of science to expose himself to the risk of committing error and to submit to criticism in order that science may continue to progress. A writer has attacked the author for this very severely, saying, here is a scientific ideal, very limited and very paltry. But those who are endowed with a mind sufficiently serious and impersonal as not to believe that all that they write is the expression of truth absolute and eternal, approve of this theory, which places the aims of science well above the miserable vanity and paltry amour-propre of the scientist. Guglielmo Ferrero, Les lois psychologiques du symbolisme, 1895, preface. An introduction to psychoanalysis and analytic psychology. When Professor Freud of Vienna made his early discoveries in the realm of the neuroses and announced that the basis and origin of the various symptoms grouped under the terms hysteria and neuroses lay in unfulfilled desires and wishes, unexpressed and unknown to the patient for the most part, and concerned chiefly with the sexual instinct, it was not realized what far-reaching influence this unpopular and bitterly attacked theory would exert on the understanding of human life in general. For this theory has so widened in its scope that its application has now extended beyond a particular group of pathologic states. It has in fact led to a new evaluation of the whole conduct of human life. A new comprehension has developed which explains those things which formerly were unexplained. And there is offered an understanding not only of the symptoms of a neurosis and the phenomena of conduct, but the product of the mind as expressed in myths and religions. This amazing growth has proceeded steadily in an ever-widening fashion, despite opposition as violent as any of which we have knowledge in the past. The criticism originally directed towards the little understood and much disliked sexual conception now includes the further teachings of a psychology.
You've reached the end of this preview. To listen to the full title, you can buy it in your player.
Which, by the application to it of such damning phrases as mystical, metaphysical, and sacrilegious, is condemned as unscientific. To add to the general confusion and misunderstanding surrounding this new school of thought, there has arisen a division amongst the leaders themselves, so that there now exist two schools led respectively by Professor Sigmund Freud of Vienna and Dr. Carl Jung of Zurich, referred to in the literature as the Vienna School and the Zurich School. It is very easy to understand that criticism and opposition should develop against a psychology so difficult of comprehension, and so disturbing to the ideas which have been held by humanity for ages. A psychology which, furthermore, requires a special technique as well as an observer trained to recognize and appreciate in psychologic phenomena a verification of the statement that there is no such thing as chance, and that every act and every expression has its own meaning, determined by the inner feelings and wishes of the individual. It is not a simple matter to come out boldly and state that every individual is, to a large extent, the determiner of his own destiny, for only by poets and philosophers has this idea been put forth, not by science. And it is a brave act to make this statement with full consciousness of all its meaning, and to stand ready to prove it by scientific reasoning and procedure. Developed entirely through empirical investigation and through an analysis of individual cases, Freudian psychology seems particularly to belong to that conception of Max Müller's that an empirical acquaintance with facts rises to a scientific knowledge of facts as soon as the mind discovers beneath the multiplicity of single productions the unity of an organic system. Psychoanalysis is the name given to the method developed for reaching down into the hidden depths of the individual to bring to light the underlying motives and determinants of his symptoms and attitudes, and to reveal the unconscious tendencies which lie behind actions and reactions and which influence development and determine the relations of life itself. The result of digging down into the hidden psyche has been to produce a mass of material from below the threshold of consciousness, so astonishing and disturbing and out of relation with the previously held values as to arouse in anyone unfamiliar with the process the strongest antagonism and criticism. Although originally studied only as a therapeutic method for the sick, it was soon realized through an analysis of normal people how slight were the differences in the content of the unconscious of the sick and of the normal. The differences observed were seen to be rather in the reactions to life and to the conflicts produced by contending forces in the individual. These conflicts, usually not fully perceived by the individual, and having to do with objectionable desires and wishes that are not in keeping with the conscious idea of self, produced marked effects which are expressed either in certain opinions, prejudices, attitudes of conduct, faulty actions, or in some definite pathologic symptom. As Dr. Jung says, he who remains healthy has to struggle with the same complexes that cause the neurotic to fall ill. In a valuable book called The Neighbor, written by the late Professor N. Shaler of Harvard University, there occurs this very far-reaching statement. It is hardly too much to say that all the important errors of conduct, all the burdens of men or of societies, are caused by the inadequacies in the association of the primal animal emotions with those mental powers which have been so rapidly developed in mankind. This statement, reached by a process of reasoning and a method of thought and study entirely different from psychoanalysis, nevertheless so completely expresses in brief form the very basis of the postulates developed through psychoanalysis that I quoted here. Such a statement, made in the course of a general examination of human relations, does not arouse opposition, nor seem to be so difficult of acceptance. It appears to be the individual application of these conceptions that has roused such bitter antagonism and violent denunciations. Rightly understood and used, psychoanalysis may be compared to surgery, for psychoanalysis stands in the same relation to the personality as surgery does to the body, and they aim at parallel results. It is well recognized that in the last analysis, nature is the real physician, the healer of wounds. But prior to the development of our modern asepsis and surgical technique, the healing produced by nature was most often of a very faulty and imperfect type. Hideous scars, distorted and crippled limbs, with functions impaired or incapacitated, resulted from the wounds. Or else nature was unable to cope with the hurt and the injured one succumbed. Science has been steadily working for centuries with the aim of understanding nature and finding means to aid and cooperate with her so that healing could take place with the least possible loss of function or permanent injury to the individual. Marvelous results have rewarded these persistent efforts, as the brilliant achievements of surgery plainly indicate. Meantime, however, little thought was given to the possibility of any scientific method being available to help man overcome the wounds and conflicts taking place in his soul, hurts which retarded his development and progress as a personality, and which frequently in the struggle resulted in physical pains and symptoms of the most varied character. That was left solely to religion and metaphysics. Now, however, this same assistance that surgery has given to the physical body, psychoanalysis attempts to give to the personality. That it cannot always succeed is as much to be expected, and more than that surgery does not always succeed. For the analytic work requires much of the individual. No real result can be attained if he has not already developed a certain quality of character and intelligence which makes it possible for him to submit himself to a facing of his naked soul, and to the pain and suffering which this often entails. Here, as in no other relation in life, an absolute truth and an absolute honesty are the only basis of action, since deception of any kind deceives no one but the individual himself, and acts as a boomerang, defeating his own aims. Such deep searching and penetrating into the soul is not something to be undertaken lightly, nor to be considered a trivial or simple matter. And the fact is that where a strong compulsion is lacking, such as sickness or a situation too difficult to meet, much courage is required to undertake it. In order to understand this psychology, which is pervading all realms of thought and seems destined to be a new psychological philosophical system for the understanding and practical advancement of human life, it will be necessary to go somewhat into detail regarding its development and present status. For in this new direction lies its greatest value and its greatest danger. The beginnings of this work were first published in 1895 in a book entitled Studien über Hysterik, and contained the joint investigations into hysteria of Dr. Breuer of Vienna and his pupil Dr. Sigmund Freud. The results of their investigations seemed to show that the various symptoms grouped under the title of hysteria were the result of emotionally colored reminiscences which, all unknown to the conscious waking self, were really actively expressing themselves through the surrogate form of symptoms, and that these experiences, although forgotten by the patient, could be reproduced and the emotional content discharged. Hypnosis was the means used to enable the physician to penetrate deeply into the forgotten memories, for it was found through hypnosis that these lost incidents and circumstances were not really lost at all, but only dropped from consciousness, and were capable of being revived when given the proper stimuli. The astonishing part about it was that with the revival of these memories and their accompanying painful and disturbing emotions, the symptoms disappeared. This led naturally to the conclusion that these symptoms were dependent upon some emotional disturbance or psychic trauma which had been inadequately expressed, and that in order to cure the patient, one merely had to establish the connection between the memory and the emotions, which properly belonged to it, letting the emotion work itself out through a reproduction of the forgotten scene. With further investigation, Freud found that hypnosis was unnecessary for the revival of the forgotten experiences, and that it was possible to obtain the lost emotional material in the conscious and normal state. For this purpose, the patient was encouraged to assume a passive, non-critical attitude and simply let his thoughts flow, speaking of whatever came into his mind, holding nothing back. During this free and easy discussion of his life and conditions, directed by the law of association of ideas, reference was invariably made to the experiences or thoughts which were the most effective and disturbing elements. It was seen to be quite impossible to avoid this indirect revelation because of the strength of the emotions surrounding these ideas and the effect of the conscious wish to repress unpleasant feelings. This important group of ideas or impressions, with the feelings and emotions clustered around them, which are betrayed through this process, was called by Jung a complex. However, with the touching of the complex, which always contains feelings and emotions so painful or unpleasant as to be unacceptable to consciousness, and which are therefore repressed and hidden, great difficulties appeared, for very often the patient came to a sudden stop and could apparently stop and could apparently recall nothing more. Memory gaps were frequent, relations twisted, etc. Evidently some force banished these memories so that the person was quite honest in saying that he could remember nothing or that there was nothing to tell. This kind of forgetfulness was called repression, and is the normal mechanism by which nature protects the individual from such painful feelings as are caused by unpleasant and unacceptable experiences and thoughts. The recognition of his egoistic nature and the often quite unbearable conflict of his weaknesses with his feelings of idealism. At this early time, great attention was given towards developing a technique which would render more easy the reproduction of these forgotten memories. For with the abandonment of hypnosis, it was seen that some unknown active force was at work, which not only banished painful memories and feelings, but also prevented their return. This was called resistance. This resistance was found to be the important mechanism which interfered with a free flow of thought and produced the greatest difficulty in the further conduct of the analysis. It appeared under various guises and frequently manifested itself in intellectual objections based on reasoning ground, in criticism directed towards the analyst, or in criticism of the method itself, and finally, often in a complete blocking of expression, so that until the resistance was broken, nothing more could be produced. It was necessary then to find some aid by which these resistances could be overcome, and the repressed memories and feelings revived and set free. For it was proven again and again that even though the person was not at all aware of concealing within himself some emotionally disturbing feeling or experience with which his symptoms were associated, yet such was the fact, and that under proper conditions, this material could be brought into consciousness. This realm, where these unknown but disturbing emotions were hidden, was called the unconscious. The unconscious also being a name used arbitrarily to indicate all that material of which the person is not aware at the given time, the not conscious. This term is used very loosely in Freudian psychology and is not intended to provoke any academic discussion, but to conform strictly to the dictionary classification of a negative concept which can neither be described nor defined. To say that an idea or feeling is unconscious merely means to indicate that the individual is unaware at that time of its existence, or that all the material of which he is unaware at a given time is unconscious. With the discovery of the significance in relation to hysteria of these varied experiences and forgotten memories, which always led into the erotic realm and usually were carried far back into early childhood, the theory of an infantile sexual trauma as a cause of this neurosis developed. Contrary to the usual belief that children have no sexuality and that only at puberty does it suddenly arise, it was definitely shown that there was a very marked kind of sexuality among children of the most tender years, entirely instinctive and capable of producing a grave effect on the entire later life. However, further investigations carried into the lives of normal people disclosed quite as many psychic and sexual traumas in their early childhood as in the lives of the patients. Therefore, the conception of the infantile sexual trauma as the etiological factor was abandoned in favor of the infantilism of sexuality itself. In other words, it was soon realized that many of the sexual traumas which were placed in their early childhood by these patients did not really exist except in their own fantasies, and probably were produced as a defense against the memories of their own childish sexual activities. These experiences led to a deep investigation into the nature of the child's sexuality, and developed the ideas which Freud incorporated in a work called 3 Contributions to the Sexual Theory. He found so many variations and manifestations of sexual activity even among young children that he realized that this activity was the normal, although entirely unconscious, expression of the child's developing life, and while not comparable to the adult sexuality, nevertheless produced a very definite influence and effect on the child's life. These childish expressions of this instinct he called polymorphous perverse, because in many ways they resembled the various abnormalities called perversions when found among adults under certain conditions. In the light of these additional investigations, Freud was led to change his formulation. For instead of the symptoms of the neurotic patient being due to definite sexual experiences, they seemed to be determined by his reactions towards his own sexual constitution and the kind of repression to which these instincts were subjected. Perhaps one of the greatest sources of misunderstanding and difficulty in this whole subject lies in the term sexuality. For Freud's conception of this is entirely different from that of the popular sense. He conceives sexuality to be practically synonymous with the word love, and to include under this term all those tender feelings and emotions which have had their origin in a primitive erotic source, even if now their primary aim is entirely lost and another substituted for it. It must also be borne in mind that Freud strictly emphasizes the psychic side of sexuality and its importance, as well as the somatic expression. Therefore, to understand Freud's theories, his very broad conception of the term sexual must never be forgotten. Through this careful investigation of the psychic life of the individual, the tremendous influence and importance of fantasy making for the fate was definitely shown. It was discovered that the indulgence in daydreams and fantasies was practically universal, not only among children but among adults, that even whole lives were being lived out in a fantastic world created by the dreamer, a world wherein he could fulfill all those wishes and desires which were found to be too difficult or impossible to satisfy in the world of reality. Much of this fantasy thinking was seen to be scarcely conscious, but arose from unrealized wishes, desires, and strivings, which could only express themselves through veiled symbols in the form of fantastic structures not understood nor fully recognized. Indeed, it is perhaps one of the most common human experiences to find queer thoughts, undesired ideas, and images forcing themselves upon one's attention to such an extent that the will has to be employed to push them out of mind. It is not unusual to discover long-forgotten impressions of childhood assuming a fantastic shape in memory, and dwelt upon as though they were still of importance. This material afforded a rich field for the searchers into the soul, for through the operation of the law of association of ideas, these fantastic products, traced back to their origin, reveal the fact that instead of being meaningless or foolish, they were produced by a definite process and arose from distinct wishes and desires, which unconsciously veiled themselves in these mysterious forms and pictures. It is conceded that the most completely unconscious product of an individual is his dream, and therefore Professor Freud turned his attention from fantasies and daydreams to the investigation of the nightly dreams of his patients, to discover whether they would throw light upon the painful feelings and ideas repressed out of consciousness, and therefore inaccessible to direct revelation. This brilliant idea soon led to a rich fruiting, for it became evident that, contrary to the usual conception that the dream is a fantastic and absurd jumble of heterogeneous fragments, having no real relation to the life of the individual, it is full of meaning. In fact, it is usually concerned with the problem of life most pressing at the time, which expresses itself not directly but in symbolic form so as to be unrecognized. In this way, the individual gains an expression and fulfillment of his unrealized wish or desire. This discovery of the symbolic nature of the dream and the fantasy was brought about entirely through the associative method and developed empirically through investigations of the dreams of many people. In this manner, it became evident that certain ideas and objects, which recurred again and again in the dreams and fantasies of different people, were definitely associated with certain unconscious or unrecognized wishes and desires, and were repeatedly used by the mind to express these meanings where a direct form was repressed and unallowed. Thus, certain dream expressions and figures were, in a general way, considered to be rather definite symbols of these repressed ideas and feelings found in the unconscious. Through a comparative and parallel study, it soon appeared that there was a similar mechanism at work in myths and fairy tales, and that the relationship between the dreams and fantasies of an individual and the myths and folk tales of a people was so close that Abraham could say that the myth is a fragment of the infantile soul life of the race, and the dream is the myth of the individual. Thus, through relating his dreams, the patient himself furnished the most important means of gaining access to the unconscious and disturbing complexes with which his symptoms were connected. Besides the dream analysis, the patient furnished other means of revelation of his complexes. His mannerisms and unconscious acts, his opening remarks to his physician, his emotional reactions to certain ideas. In short, the whole behavior and verbal expressions of the individual reveal his inner nature and problems. Through all this work, it became clear that in the emotional nature lay the origin not only of the various nervous illnesses themselves, but also of the isolated symptoms and individual idiosyncrasies and peculiarities which are the part of all humanity, and that the pathogenic cause of the disturbances lies not in the ignorance of individuals, but in those inner resistances which are the underlying basis of this ignorance. Therefore, the aim of the therapy became not merely the relief of the ignorance, but the searching out and combating of these resistances. It becomes evident from even this brief description of the analytic procedure that we are dealing with a very complex and delicate material, and with a technique which needs to make definite use of all influences available for the help of the patient. It has long been recognized that the relation established between physician and patient has a great effect upon the medical assistance which he is able to render. In other words, if a confidence and personal regard developed in the patient towards the physician, the latter's advice was just so much more efficacious. This personal feeling has been frankly recognized and made of distinct service in psychoanalytic treatment under the name of transference. It is through the aid of this definite relationship, which must be established in the one being analyzed towards the analyst, that it is possible to deal with the unconscious and organized resistances which so easily blind the individual and render the acceptance of the new valuations very difficult to the raw and sensitive soul. Freud's emphasis upon the role of the sexual instinct in the production of the neurosis, and also in its determining power upon the personality of the normal individual, does not imply that he does not also recognize other determinants at the root of human conduct, as for instance the instinct for preservation of life, and the ego principle itself. But these motives are not so violently forbidden and repressed as the sexual impulse, and therefore, because of that repressive force and the strength of the impulse, he considers this primary in its influence upon the human being. The importance of this instinct upon human life is clearly revealed by the great place given to it under the name of love in art, literature, poetry, romance, and all beauty from the beginning of recorded time. Viewed in this light, it cannot seem extraordinary that a difficulty or disturbance in this emotional field should produce such far-reaching consequences for the individual. The sexual impulse is often compared with that of hunger, and this craving and need lying in all humanity is called by Freud libido. The Oedipus problem. With further investigations into the nature of the repressed complexes, a very astonishing situation was revealed. The parental influence on children is something so well recognized and understood that to call attention to it sounds much like a banality. However, here an extraordinary discovery was made, for in tracing out the feelings and emotions of adults, it became evident that this influence was paramount not only for children but for adults as well, that the entire direction of lives was largely determined quite unconsciously by the parental associations, and that, although adults, the emotional side of their nature was still infantile in type, and demanded unconsciously the infantile or childish relations. Freud traces out the commencement of the infantile attachment for the parents in this wise. In the beginning, the child derives its first satisfaction and pleasure from the mother in the form of nutrition and care for its wants. In this first act of suckling, Freud sees already a kind of sexual pleasure, for he apparently identifies the pleasure principle and the sexual instinct and considers that the former is primarily rooted in the latter. At this early time commence such various infantile actions unconnected with nutrition as thumb-sucking, various movements of the body as rubbing, boring, pulling, and other manifestations of a definite interest in its own body, a delight in nakedness, the pleasure exhibited in inflicting pain on some object, and its opposite, the pleasure from receiving pain. All of these afford the child pleasure and satisfaction, and because they seem analogous to certain perversions in adults, they are called by Freud the polymorphous, perverse sexuality of childhood. The character of these instinctive actions, which have nothing to do with any other person, and through which the child attains pleasure from its own body, caused Freud to term this phase of life as autoerotic, after Havelock Ellis. However, with the growth of the child, there is a parallel development of the psychic elements of its sexual nature, and now the mother, the original object of its love, primarily determined by its helplessness and need, acquires a new valuation. The beginnings of the need for a love object to satisfy the craving or libido of the child are early in evidence, and, following along sex lines in general, the little son prefers the mother and the daughter the father, after the usual preference of the parents. At this early time, children feel deeply the enormous importance of their parents, and their entire world is bounded by the family circle. All the elements of the ego which the child possesses have now become manifest: love, jealousy, curiosity, hate, etc. And those instincts are directed in the greatest degree towards the objects of their libido, namely the parents. With the growing ego of the child, there is a development of strong wishes and desires demanding satisfaction, which can only be gratified by the mother. Therefore, there is aroused in the small son the feeling of jealousy and anger towards the father, in whom he sees a rival for the affection of the mother, and whom he would like to replace. This desire in the soul of the child, Freud calls the Oedipus complex. It calls the Oedipus complex, in recognition of its analogy to the tragedy of King Oedipus, who was drawn by his fate to kill his father and win his mother for a wife. Freud presents this as the nuclear complex of every neurosis. At the basis of this complex, some trace of which can be found in every person, Freud sees a definite incest wish towards the mother, which only lacks the quality of consciousness. Because of moral reactions, this wish is quickly subjected to repression through the operation of the incest barrier, a postulate he compares to the incest taboo found among inferior peoples. At this time, the child is beginning to develop its typical sexual curiosity, expressed by the question, "Where do I come from?" The interest and investigation of the child into this problem, aided by observations and deductions from various actions and attitudes of the parents, who have no idea of the watchfulness of the child, lead him, because of his imperfect knowledge and immature development, into many false theories and ideas of birth. These infantile sexual theories are held by Freud to be determinative in the development of the child's character, and also for the contents of the unconscious as expressed in a future neurosis. These various reactions of the child and his sexual curiosity are entirely normal and unavoidable. And if his development proceeds in an orderly fashion, then, at the time of definite object choice, he will pass smoothly over from the limitations of the family attachment out into the world and find therein his independent existence. However, if the libido remains fixed on the first chosen object, so that the growing individual is unable to tear himself loose from these familial ties, then the incestuous bond is deepened with the developing sexual instinct and its accompanying need of a love object, and the entire future of the young personality endangered. For with the development of the incestuous bond, the natural repressions deepen, because the moral censor cannot allow these disturbing relations to become clear to the individual. Therefore, the whole matter is repressed more deeply into the unconscious, and even a feeling of positive enmity and repulsion towards the parents is often developed in order to conceal and overcompensate for the impossible situation actually present. This persistence of the attachment of the libido to the original object, and the inability to find in this a suitable satisfaction for the adult need, interferes with the normal development of the psychosexual character. And it is due to this that the adult retains that infantilism of sexuality which plays so great a role in determining the instability of the emotional life, which so frequently leads into the definite neuroses. These were the conclusions reached and the ground on which Freudian psychology rested regarding the etiology of the neurosis and the tendencies underlying normal human mechanisms, when Dr. Carl Jung, the most prominent of Freud's disciples and the leader of the Zurich school, found himself no longer able to agree with Freud's findings in certain particulars. although the phenomena which Freud observed and the technique of psychoanalysis developed by Freud were the material on which Jung worked and the value of which he clearly emphasizes. The differences which have developed lay in his understanding and interpretation of the phenomena observed. Beginning with the conception of libido itself as a term used to connote sexual hunger and craving, albeit the meaning of the word sexual was extended by Freud to embrace a much wider significance than common usage has assigned it, Jung was unable to confine himself to this limitation. He conceived this longing, this urge or push of life, as something extending beyond sexuality, even in its wider sense. He saw in the term libido a concept of unknown nature, comparable to Bergson's élan vital, a hypothetical energy of life which occupies itself not only in sexuality but in various physiological and psychological manifestations such as growth, development, hunger, and all the human activities and interests. This cosmic energy or urge manifested in the human being he calls libido, and compares it with the energy of physics, although recognizing, in common with Freud as well as with many others, the primal instinct of reproduction as the basis of many functions and present-day activities of mankind, no longer sexual in character. He repudiates the idea of still calling them sexual, even though their development was a growth originally out of the sexual. Sexuality and its various manifestations Jung sees as most important channels occupied by libido, but not the exclusive ones through which libido flows. This is an energic concept of life, and from this viewpoint, this hypothetical energy of life, or libido, is a living power used instinctively by man in all the automatic processes of his functioning, such very processes being but different manifestations of this energy. By virtue of its quality of mobility and change, man, through his understanding and intelligence, has the power consciously to direct and use his libido in definite and desired ways. In this conception of Jung will be seen an analogy to Bergson, who speaks of this change, this movement and becoming, this self-creation, call it what you will, as the very stuff and reality of our being. In developing the energic conception of libido and separating it from Freud's sexual definition, Jung makes possible the explanation of interest in general and provides a working concept by which not only the specifically sexual, but the general activities and reactions of man can be understood. If a person complains of no longer having interest in his work or of losing interest in his surroundings, then one understands that his libido is withdrawn from this object and that, in consequence, the object itself seems no longer attractive. Whereas, as a matter of fact, the object itself is exactly the same as formerly. In other words, it is the libido that we bestow upon an object that makes it attractive and interesting. The causes for the withdrawal of libido may be various and are usually quite different from those that the persons offer in explanation. It is the task of psychoanalysis to discover the real reasons, which are usually hidden and unknown. On the other hand, when an individual exhibits an exaggerated interest or places an overemphasis upon an idea or situation, then we know there is too much libido here, and that we may find as a consequence a corresponding depletion elsewhere. This leads directly into the second point of difference between Jung's views and those of Freud. This is concerned with those practically universal, childish manifestations of sexuality called by Freud polymorphous perverse, because of their similarity to those abnormalities of sexuality which occur in adults and are called perversions. Jung takes exception to this viewpoint. He sees, in the various manifestations of childhood, the precursors or forerunners of the later fully developed sexuality, and instead of considering them perverse, he considers them preliminary expressions of sexual coloring. He divides human life into 3 stages. The first stage, up to about the 3rd or 4th year, generally speaking, he calls the pre-sexual stage, for there he sees the libido, or life energy, occupied chiefly in the functions of nutrition and growth. And he draws an analogy between this period and that of the caterpillar stage of the butterfly. stage of the butterfly. The second stage includes the years from this time until puberty, and this he speaks of as the pre-pubertal stage. The third period is that from puberty onward, and can be considered the time of maturity. It is in the earliest stage, the period of which varies greatly in different individuals, that are fully inaugurated those various manifestations which have so marked a sexual coloring that there can be no question of their relationship, although at that time sexuality in the adult meaning of the word does not exist. Jung explains the polymorphism of these phenomena as arising from a gradual movement of the libido from exclusive service in the function of nutrition into new avenues which successively open up with the development of the child, until the final inauguration of the sexual function proper at puberty. Normally, these childish bad habits are gradually relinquished until the libido is entirely withdrawn from these immature phases, and with the ushering in of puberty for the first time appears in the form of an undifferentiated sexual primitive power, clearly forcing the individual towards division, budding, etc. However, if, in the course of its movement from the function of nutrition to the sexual function, the libido is arrested or retarded at any phase, then a fixation may result, creating a disturbance in the harmony of the normal development. For although the libido is retarded and remains clinging to some childish manifestation, time goes on and the physical growth of the child does not stand still. Soon a great contrast is created between the infantile manifestations of the emotional life and the needs of the more adult individual, and the foundation is thus prepared for either the development of a definite neurosis, or else for those weaknesses of character or symptomatic disturbances which are not sufficiently serious to be called a neurosis. One of the most active and important forms of childish libido occupation is in fantasy making. The child's world is one of imagery and make-believe, where he can create for himself that satisfaction and enjoyment which the world of reality so often denies. As the child grows and real demands of life are made upon him, it becomes increasingly necessary that his libido be taken away from his fantastic world and used for the required adaptation to reality needed by his age and condition, until finally for the adult the freedom of the whole libido is necessary to meet the biological and cultural demands of life. Instead of thus employing the libido in the real world, however, certain people never relinquish the seeking for satisfaction in the shadowy world of fantasy, and even though they make certain attempts at adaptation, they are halted and discouraged by every difficulty and obstacle in the path of life, and are easily pulled back into their inner psychic world. This condition is called a state of introversion. It is concerned with the past and the reminiscences which belong thereto. Situations and experiences which should have been completed and finished long ago are still dwelt upon and lived with. Images and matters which were once important but which normally have no significance for their later age are still actively influencing their present lives. The nature and character of these fantasy products are legion and are easily recognized in the emotional attitudes and pretensions the childish illusions and exaggerations, the prejudices and inconsistencies which people express in manifold forms. The actual situation is inadequately faced. Small matters are reacted towards in an exaggerated manner, or else a frivolous attitude is maintained where real seriousness is demanded. In other words, there is clearly manifested an inadequate psychic adaptation towards reality, which is quite to be expected from the child, but which is very discordant in the adult. The most important of these past influences is that of the parents, because they are the first objects of the developing childish love and afford the first satisfaction and pleasure to the child. They become the models for all succeeding efforts, as Freud has worked out. This he called the nuclear or root complex, because this influence was so powerful it seemed to be the determining factor in all later difficulties in the life of the individual. In this phase of the problem lies the third great difference between Jung's interpretation and that of Freud. Jung definitely recognizes that there are many neurotic persons who clearly exhibited in their childhood the same neurotic tendencies that are later exaggerated. Also, that an almost overwhelming effect on the destiny of these children is exercised by the influence of the parents, the frequent over-anxiety or tenderness, the lack of sympathy or understanding. In other words, the complexes of the parent reacting upon the child and producing in him love, admiration, fear, distrust, hate, revolt. The greater the sensitiveness and impressionability of the child, the more he will be stamped with the familial environment, and the more he will unconsciously seek to find again in the world of reality the model of his own small world, with all the pleasures and satisfactions, or disappointments and unhappinesses with which it was filled. This condition, to be sure, is not a recognized or a conscious one, for the individual may think himself perfectly free from this past influence, because he is living in the real world, and because actually there is a great difference between the present conditions and that of his childish past. He sees all this intellectually, but there is a wide gap between the intellectual grasp of a situation and the emotional development, and it is the latter realm wherein lies the disharmony. However, although many ideas and feelings are connected with the parents, analysis reveals very often that they are only subjective, and that in reality they bear little resemblance to the actual past situation. Therefore, Jung speaks no longer of the real father and mother, but uses the term imago, or image, to represent the father or mother, because the feelings and fantasies frequently do not deal with the real parents, but with a distorted and subjective image created by the imagination of the individual. Following this distinction, Jung sees in the Oedipus complex of Freud only a symbol for the childish desire towards the parents and for the conflict which this craving evokes, and cannot accept the theory that in this early stage of childhood the mother has any real sexual significance for the child. The demands of the child upon the mother, the jealousy so often exhibited, are at first connected with the role of the mother as protector, caretaker, and supplier of nutritive wants, and only later with the germinating eroticism does the child's love become admixed with the developing sexual quality. The chief love objects are still the parents, and he naturally continues to seek and to find in them satisfaction for all his desires. In this way, the typical conflict is developed, which in the son is directed towards the father and in the daughter towards the mother. This jealousy of the daughter towards the mother is called the Electra complex, from the myth of Electra, who took revenge on her mother for the murder of the husband, because she was in this way deprived of her father. Normally, as puberty is attained, the child gradually becomes more or less freed from his parents, and upon the degree in which this is accomplished depends his health and future well-being. This demand of nature upon the young individual to free himself from the bonds of his childish dependency and to find in the world of reality his independent existence is so imperious and dominating that it frequently produces in the child the greatest struggles and severest conflicts, the period being characterized symbolically as a self-sacrifice by Jung. It frequently happens that the young person is so closely bound in the family relations that it is only with the greatest difficulty that he can attain any measure of freedom, and then only very imperfectly, so that the libido sexualis can only express itself in certain feelings and fantasies which clearly reveal the existence of the complex, until then entirely hidden and unrealized. Now commences the secondary struggle against the unfilial and immoral feelings, with a consequent development of intense resistances expressing themselves in irritation, anger, revolt, and antagonism against the parents, or else in an especially tender, submissive, and yielding attitude which overcompensates for the rebellion and reaction held within. This struggle and conflict gives rise to the unconscious fantasy of self-sacrifice, which really means the sacrificing of the childish tendencies and love type in order to free libido. For his nature demands that he attain the capacity for the accomplishment of his own personal fulfillment, the satisfaction of which belongs to the developed man and woman. This conception has been worked out in detail by Jung in the book which is herein presented to English readers. We now come to the most important of Jung's conceptions, in that it bears practically upon the treatment of certain types of the neuroses, and stands theoretically in direct opposition to Freud's hypothesis. While recognizing fully the influence of the parents and of the sexual constitution of the child, Jung refuses to see in this infantile past the real cause for the later development of the illness. He definitely places the cause of the pathogenic conflict in the present moment, and considers that in seeking for the cause in the distant past, one is only following the desire of the patient, which is to withdraw himself as much as possible from the present important period. The conflict is produced by some important task or duty which is essential biologically and practically for the fulfillment of the ego of the individual, but before which an obstacle arises from which he shrinks, and thus halted cannot go on. With this interference in the path of progression, libido is stored up, and a regression takes place whereby there occurs a reanimation of past ways of libido occupation which were entirely normal to the child, but which for the adult are no longer of value. These regressive infantile desires and fantasies, now alive and striving for satisfaction, are converted into symptoms, and in these surrogate forms obtain a certain gratification, thus creating the external manifestations of the neurosis. Therefore, Jung does not ask from what psychic experience or point of fixation in childhood the patient is suffering, but what is the present duty or task he is avoiding, or what obstacle in his life's path he is unable to overcome. What is the cause of his regression to past psychic experiences? Following this theory, Jung expresses the view that the elaborate fantasies and dreams produced by these patients are really forms of compensation or artificial substitutes for the unfulfilled adaptation to reality. The sexual content of these fantasies and dreams is only apparently and not actually expressive of a real sexual desire or incest wish, but is a regressive employment of sexual forms to symbolically express a present-day need when the attainment of the present ego demand seems too difficult or impossible, and no adaptation is made to what is possible for the individual's capability. With this statement, Jung throws a new light on the work of analytic psychology and on the conception of the neurotic symptoms, and renders possible of understanding the many apparent incongruities and conflicting observations which have been so disturbing to the critics. It now becomes proper to ask what has been established by all this massive investigation into the soul, and what is its value not only as a therapeutic measure for the neurotic sufferer, but also for the normal human being. First, and perhaps most important, is the recognition of a definite psychological determinism. Instead of human life being filled with foolish, meaningless, or purposeless actions, errors, and thoughts, it can be demonstrated that no expression or manifestation of the psyche, however trifling or inconsistent in appearance, is really lawless or unmotivated. Only a possession of the technique is necessary in order to reveal to anyone desirous of knowing the existence of the unconscious determinants of his mannerisms, trivial expressions, acts and behavior, their purpose and significance. This leads into the second fundamental conception, which is perhaps even less considered than the foregoing, and that is the relative value of the conscious mind and thought. It is the general attitude of people to judge themselves by their surface motives, to satisfy themselves by saying or thinking, "This is what I want to do," or say, or "I intended to do thus and so." But somehow, what one thought, one intended to say, or expected to do, is very often the contrary of what actually is said or done. Everyone has had these experiences when the gap between the conscious thought and action was gross enough to be observed. It is also a well-known experience to consciously desire something very much, and when it is obtained, to discover that this in no wise satisfied or lessened the desire which was then transferred to some other object. Thus one became cognizant of the fact that the feeling and idea presented by consciousness as the desire was an error. What is the difficulty in these conditions? Evidently some other directing force than that of which we are aware is at work. Dr. G. Stanley Hall uses a very striking symbol when he compares the mind to an iceberg, floating in the ocean with 1/8 visible above the water and 7/8 below. The 1/8 above being that part called conscious, and the 7/8 below that which we call the unconscious. The influence and controlling power of the unconscious desires over our thoughts and acts are in this relative proportion. Faint glimmers of other motives and interests than those we accept or which we believe often flit into consciousness. These indications, if studied or valued accurately, would lead to the realization that consciousness is but a single stage and but one form of expression of mind. Therefore, its dictum is but one, often untrustworthy, approach to the great question as to what is man's actual psychic accomplishment, and as to what in particular is the actual soul development of the individual. A further contribution of equal importance has been the empiric development of a dynamic theory of life. The conception that life is in a state of flux movement leading either to construction or destruction. Through the development man has reached, he has attained the power by means of his intelligence and understanding of definitely directing to a certain extent this life energy or libido into avenues which serve his interest and bring a real satisfaction for the present day. When man, through ignorance and certain inherent tendencies, fails to recognize his needs or his power to fulfill them, or to adapt himself to the conditions of reality of the present time, there is then produced that reanimation of infantile paths by which an attempt is made to gain fulfillment or satisfaction through the production of symptoms or attitudes. The acceptance of these statements demands the recognition of the existence of an infantile sexuality, and the large part played by it in the later life of the individual. Because of the power and imperious influence exerted by the parents upon the child, and because of the unconscious attachment of his libido to the original object, the mother, and the perseverance of this first love model in the psyche, he finds it very difficult on reaching the stage of adult development and the time for seeking a love object outside of the family to gain a satisfactory model. It is exceedingly important for parents and teachers to recognize the requirements of nature, which, beginning with puberty, imperiously demand of the young individual a separation of himself from the parent stem and the development of an independent existence. In our complex modern civilization, this demand of nature is difficult enough of achievement for the child who has the heartiest and most intelligent cooperation of his parents and environment. But for the one who has not only to contend with his own inner struggle for his freedom, but has, in addition, the resistance of his parents, who would hold him in his childhood at any cost, because they cannot endure the thought of his separation from them, the task becomes one of the greatest magnitude. It is during this period when the struggle between the childish inertia and nature's urge becomes so keen that there occur the striking manifestations of jealousy, criticism, irritability, all usually directed against the parents, of defiance of parental authority, of runaways, and various other psychic and nervous disorders known to all. This struggle, which is the first great task of mankind and the one which requires the greatest effort, is that which is expressed by Jung as the self-sacrifice motive, the sacrifice of the childish feelings and demands and of the irresponsibility of this period, and the assumption of the duties and tasks of an individual existence. It is this great theme which Jung sees as the real motive lying hidden in the myths and religions of man from the beginning, as well as in the literature and artistic creations of both ancient and modern time, and which he works out with the greatest wealth of detail and painstaking effort in the book herewith presented. This necessitates a recognition and revaluation of the enormous importance and influence of the ego and the sexual instinct upon the thought and reaction of man, and also predicates a displacement of the psychological point of gravity from the will and intellect to the realm of the emotions and feelings. The desired end is a synthesis of these two paths, or the use of the intellect constructively in the service of the emotions, in order to gain for the best interest of the individual some sort of cooperative reaction between the two. No one dealing with analytic psychology can fail to be struck by the tremendous and unnecessary burdens which man has placed upon himself, and how greatly he has increased the difficulties of adaptation by his rigid intellectual views and moral formulas, and by his inability to admit to himself that he is actually just a human being, imperfect, and containing within himself all manner of tendencies, good and bad, all striving for some satisfactory goal. Further, that the refusal to see himself in this light instead of as an ideal person in no way alters the actual condition, and that in fact, through the cheap pretense of being able only to consider himself as a very virtuous person, or as shocked and hurt when observing the sins of others, he actually is prevented from developing his own character and bringing his own capacities to their fullest expressions. There is frequently expressed among people the idea of how fortunate it is that we cannot see each other's thoughts, and how disturbing it would be if our real feelings could be read. But what is so shameful in these secrets of the soul? They are, in reality, our own egoistic desires, all striving, longing, wishing for satisfaction, for happiness. Those desires which instinctively crave their own gratification, but which can only be really fulfilled by adapting them to the real world and to the social group. Why is it that it is so painful for man to admit that the prime influence in all human endeavor is found in the ego itself, in its desires, wishes, needs and satisfactions, in short, in its need for self-expression and self-perpetuation, the evolutionary impetus in life? The basis for the unpleasantness of this idea may perhaps be found in an inner resistance in nature itself, which forces man to include others in his scheme, lest his own greedy desires should serve to destroy him. But even with this inner demand and all the ethical and moral teachings of centuries, it is everywhere evident that man has only very imperfectly learned that it is to his own interest to consider his neighbor, and that it is impossible for him to ignore the needs of the body social of which he is a part. Externally, the recognition of the strength of the ego impulse is objectionable because of the ideal conception that self-striving and so-called selfish seeking are unworthy, ignoble, and incompatible with a desirable character and must be ignored at all cost. The futility of this attitude is to be clearly seen in the failure after all these centuries to even approximate it, as evidenced in our human relations and institutions, and is quite as ineffectual in this realm as in that of sexuality, where the effort to overcome this imperious domination has been attempted by lowering the instinct and seeing in it something vile or unclean, something unspeakable and unholy. Instead of destroying the power of sexuality, this struggle has only warped and distorted, injured and mutilated the expression, for not without destruction of the individual can these fundamental instincts be destroyed. Life itself has needs and imperiously demands expression through the forms created. All nature answers to this freely and simply, except man. His failure to recognize himself as an instrument through which the life energy is coursing and the demands of which must be obeyed is the cause of his misery. Despite his possession of intellect and self-consciousness, he cannot, without disaster to himself, refuse the tasks of life and the fulfillment of his own needs. Man's great task is the adaptation of himself to reality, and the recognition of himself as an instrument for the expression of life according to his individual possibilities. It is in his privilege as a self-creator that his highest purpose is found. The value of self-consciousness lies in the fact that man is enabled to reflect upon himself and learn to understand the true origin and significance of his actions and opinions, that he may adequately value the real level of his development and avoid being self-deceived, and therefore inhibited from finding his biological adaptation. He need no longer be unconscious of the motives underlying his actions or hide himself behind a changed exterior. In other words, be merely a series of reactions to stimuli, as the mechanists have it. But he may, to a certain extent, become a self-creating and self-determining being. Indeed, there seems to be an impulse towards adaptation quite as Bergson sees it, and it would seem to be a task of the highest order to use intelligence to assist oneself to work with this impulse. Through the investigation of these different avenues leading into the hidden depths of the human being, and through the revelation of the motives and influences at work there, although astonishing to the uninitiated, a very clear and definite conception of the actual human relationship brotherhood of all mankind is obtained. It is this recognition of these common factors, basically inherent in humanity from the beginning and still active, which is at once both the most hopeful and the most feared and disliked part of psychoanalysis. It is disliked by those individuals who have prided themselves upon their superiority and the distinction between their reactions and motives and those of ordinary mankind. In other words, they attempt to become personalities through elevating themselves and lowering others. And it is a distinct blow to discover that beneath these pretensions lie the very ordinary elements shared in common by all. On the other hand, to those who have been able to recognize their own weaknesses and have suffered in the privacy of their own souls, the knowledge that these things have not set them apart from others, but that they are the common property of all, and that no one can point the finger of scorn at his fellow, is one of the greatest experiences of life, and is productive of the greatest relief. It is feared by many who realize that in these painfully acquired repressions and symptoms lie their safety and their protection from directly facing and dealing with tendencies and characteristics with which they feel unable to cope. The repression and the accompanying symptoms indicate a difficulty and a struggle, and in this way are a sort of compromise or substitute formation which permit, although only in a wasteful and futile manner, the activity of the repressed tendencies. Nevertheless, to analyze the individual back to his original tendencies and reveal to him the meaning of these substitute formations would be a useless procedure, in which truly the last state of that man would be worse than the first, if the work ceased there. The aim is not to destroy those barriers upon which civilized man has so painfully climbed, and to reduce him to his primitive state, but, where these have failed or imperfectly succeeded, to help him to attain his greatest possibilities with less expenditure of energy, by less wasteful methods than nature provides. In this achievement lies the hopeful and valuable side of this method, the development of the synthesis. It is hopeful because now a way is opened to deal with these primitive tendencies constructively, and render their effects not only harmless but useful, by utilizing them in higher aims, socially and individually, valuable and satisfactory. This is what has occurred normally in those individuals who seem capable and constructive personalities, in those creative minds that give so much to the race. They have converted certain psychological tendencies which could have produced useless symptoms or destructive actions into valuable productions. Indeed, it is not uncommon for strong, capable persons to state themselves that they knew they could have been equally capable of a wasteful or destructive life. This utilization of the energy or libido freed by removing the repressions and the lifting of infantile tendencies and desires into higher purposes and directions suitable for the individual at his present status is called sublimation. It must not be understood by this discussion that geniuses or wonderful personalities can be created through analysis, for this is not the aim of the procedure. Its purpose is to remove the inhibitions and restrictions which interfere with the full development of the personality, to help individuals attain to that level where they really belong, and to prepare people to better understand and meet life, whether they are neurotic sufferers or so-called normal people, with the difficulties and peculiarities which belong to all. This reasoning and method of procedure is only new when the application is made to the human being. In all improvements of plants and animals, these general principles have been recognized and their teachings constructively utilized. Luther Burbank, that plant wizard whose work is known to all the world, says, A knowledge of the battle of the tendencies within a plant is the very basis of all plant improvement. And it is not that the work of plant improvement brings with it incidentally, as people mistakenly think, a knowledge of these forces. It is the knowledge of these forces, rather, which makes plant improvement possible. Has this not been also the mistake of man regarding himself and the cause, partly at least, of his failure to succeed in actually reaching a more advanced and stable development? This recognition of man's biological relationship to all life and the practical utilization of this recognition necessitates a readjustment of thought and asks for an examination and reconsideration of the facts of human conduct which are observable by any thoughtful person. A quiet and progressive upheaval of old ideas has taken place and is still going on. Analytic psychology attempts to unify and value all of the various phenomena of man which have been observed and noted at different times by isolated investigators of isolated manifestations, and thus bring some orderly sequence into the whole. It offers a method whereby the relations of the human being biologically to all other living forms can be established, the actual achievement of man himself adequately valued, and opens a vista of the possibilities of improvement in health, happiness, and accomplishment for the human being. Beatrice M. Hinkle. Author's note. My task in this work has been to investigate an individual fantasy system, and in the doing of it, problems of such magnitude have been uncovered that my endeavor to grasp them in their entirety has necessarily meant only a superficial orientation towards those paths, the opening and exploration of which may possibly crown the work of future investigators with success. I am not in sympathy with the attitude which favors the repression of certain possible working hypotheses, because they are perhaps erroneous and so may possess no lasting value. Certainly I endeavored as far as possible to guard myself from error, which might indeed become especially dangerous upon these dizzy heights. For I am entirely aware of the risks of these investigations. However, I do not consider scientific work as a dogmatic contest, but rather as a work done for the increase and deepening of knowledge. This contribution is addressed to those having similar ideas concerning science. In conclusion, I must render thanks to those who have assisted my endeavors with valuable aid, especially my dear wife and my friends, to whose disinterested assistance I am deeply indebted. Carl Gustav Jung, Zurich. Part 1. Introduction. Anyone who can read Freud's interpretation of the dream without scientific rebellion at the newness and apparently unjustified daring of its analytical presentation, and without moral indignation at the astonishing nudity of the dream interpretation, and who can allow this unusual array of facts to influence his mind calmly and without prejudice, will surely be deeply impressed at that place where Freud calls to mind the fact that an individual's psychologic conflict, namely the incest fantasy, is the essential root of that powerful ancient dramatic material, the Oedipus legend. The impression made by this simple reference may be likened to that wholly peculiar feeling which arises in us if, for example, in the noise and tumult of a modern street we should come across an ancient relic, the Corinthian capital of a walled-in column, or a fragment of inscription. Just a moment ago we were given over to the noisy, ephemeral life of the present, when something very far away and strange appears to us, which turns our attention to things of another order. A glimpse away from the incoherent multiplicity of the present to a higher coherence in history. Very likely it would suddenly occur to us that on this spot where we now run busily to and fro, a similar life and activity prevailed 2,000 years ago in somewhat other forms. Similar passions moved mankind, and man was likewise convinced of the uniqueness of his existence. I would liken the impression which the first acquaintance with the monuments of antiquity so easily leaves behind to that impression which Freud's reference to the Oedipus legend makes, for while we are still engaged with the confusing impressions of the variability of the individual soul, suddenly there is opened a revelation of the simple greatness of the Oedipus tragedy, that never-extinguished light of the Grecian theatre. This breadth of outlook carries in itself something of revelation. For us, the ancient psychology has long since been buried among the shadows of the past. In the schoolroom, one could scarcely repress a skeptical smile when one indiscreetly reckoned the comfortable matronly age of Penelope and the age of Jocasta, and comically compared the result of the reckoning with the tragic erotic struggles in the legend and drama. We did not know at that time, and who knows even today, that the mother can be the all-consuming passion of the son, which perhaps undermines his whole life and tragically destroys it, so that not even the magnitude of the Oedipus fate seems one jot overdrawn. Rare and pathologically understood cases like Ninon de l'Enclos and her son, footnote, he is said to have killed himself when he heard that she, whom he so passionately adored, was his mother, end of footnote, lie too far removed from most of us to give a living impression. But when we follow the paths traced out by Freud, we arrive at a recognition of the present existence of such possibilities, which, although they are too weak to enforce incest, are still strong enough to cause disturbances of considerable magnitude in the soul. The admission of such possibilities to oneself does not occur without a great burst of moral revulsion. Resistances arise which only too easily dazzle the intellect, and, through that, make knowledge of self impossible. Whenever we succeed, however, in stripping feelings from more scientific knowledge, then that abyss which separates our age from the antique is bridged. And with astonishment we see that Oedipus is still a living thing for us. The importance of such an impression should not be undervalued. We are taught by this insight that there is an identity of elementary human conflicts existing independent of time and place. That which affected the Greeks with horror still remains true, but it is true for us only when we give up a vain illusion that we are different, that is to say, more moral than the ancients. We of the present day have nearly succeeded in forgetting that an indissoluble common bond binds us to the people of antiquity. With this truth, a path is opened to the understanding of the ancient mind, an understanding which so far has not existed, and on one side leads to an inner sympathy, and on the other side to an intellectual comprehension. Through buried strata of the individual soul, we come indirectly into possession of the living mind of the ancient culture. And just precisely through that do we win that stable point of view outside our own culture, from which, for the first time, an objective understanding of their mechanisms would be possible. At least that is the hope which we get from the rediscovery of the Oedipus problem. The inquiry made possible by Freud's work has already resulted fruitfully. We are indebted to this stimulation for some bold attacks upon the territory of the history of the human mind. There are the works of Ricklin, Abraham, Rank, Maida, Jones. Recently Silberer has joined their ranks with a beautiful investigation entitled Phantasie und Mythos. We are indebted to Pfister for a comprehensive work which cannot be overlooked here, and which is of much importance for Christian religious psychology. The leading purpose of these works is the unlocking of historical problems through the application of psychoanalytic knowledge. That is to say, knowledge drawn from the activity of the modern unconscious mind concerning specific historical material. I must refer the reader entirely to the specified works, in order that he may gain information concerning the extent and the kind of insight which has already been obtained. The explanations are in many cases dubious in particulars. Nevertheless, this detracts in no way from the total result. It would be significant enough if only the far-reaching analogy between the psychologic structure of the historical relics and the structure of the recent individual psychologic products alone were demonstrated. This proof is possible of attainment for every intelligent person through the work done up to this time. The analogy prevails especially in symbolism, as Ricklin, Rank, Maida, and Abraham have pointed out with illuminating examples. It is also shown in the individual mechanisms of unconscious work, that is to say, in repression, condensation, etc., as Abraham explicitly shows. Up to the present time, the psychoanalytic investigator has turned his interest chiefly to the analysis of the individual psychologic problems. It seems to me, however, that in the present state of affairs there is a more or less imperative demand for the psychoanalyst to broaden the analysis of the individual problems by a comparative study of historical material relating to them, just as Freud has already done in a masterly manner in his book on Leonardo da Vinci. For just as the psychoanalytic conceptions promote understanding of the historic psychologic creations, so reversedly, historical materials can shed new light upon individual psychologic problems. These and similar considerations have caused me to turn my attention somewhat more to the historical, in the hope that, out of this, new insight into the foundations of individual psychology might be won. Chapter 1. Concerning the two kinds of thinking. It is a well-known fact that one of the principles of analytic psychology is that the dream images are to be understood symbolically. Symbolically. That is to say that they are not to be taken literally just as they are presented in sleep, but that behind them a hidden meaning has to be surmised. It is this ancient idea of a dream symbolism which has challenged not only criticism, but in addition to that, the strongest opposition. That dreams may be full of import and therefore something to be interpreted is certainly neither a strange nor an extraordinary idea. This has been familiar to mankind for thousands of years, and therefore seems much like a banal truth. The dream interpretations of the Egyptians and Chaldeans, and the story of Joseph, who interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, are known to everyone, and the dream book of Artemidorus is also familiar. From countless inscribed monuments of all times and peoples, we learn of foreboding dreams, of significant, of prophetic, and also of curative dreams, which the deities sent to the sick, sleeping in the temple. We know the dream of the mother of Augustus, who dreamt she was to be with child by the deity transformed into a snake. We will not heap up references and examples to bear witness to the existence of a belief in the symbolism of dreams. When an idea is so old and is so generally believed, it is probably true in some way, and indeed, as is mostly the case, is not literally true, but is true psychologically. In this distinction lies the reason why the old fogies of science have, from time to time, thrown away an inherited piece of ancient truth, because it was not literal, but psychologic truth. For such discrimination, this type of person has at no time had any comprehension. From our experience, it is hardly conceivable that a God existing outside of ourselves causes dreams, or that the dream eo ipso, by the thing itself, foresees the future prophetically. When we translate this into the psychologic, however, then the ancient theories sound much more reconcilable. Namely, the dream arises from a part of the mind unknown to us, but nonetheless important, and is concerned with the desires for the approaching day. This psychologic formula, derived from the ancient superstitious concept of dreams, is, so to speak, exactly identified with the Freudian psychology, which assumes a rising wish from the unconscious to be the source of the dream. As the old belief teaches, the deity or the demon speaks in symbolic speech to the sleeper, and the dream interpreter has the riddle to solve. In modern speech, we say this means that the dream is a series of images which are apparently contradictory and nonsensical, but arise in reality from psychologic material which yields a clear meaning. Were I to suppose among my readers a far-reaching ignorance of dream analysis, then I should be obliged to illustrate this statement with numerous examples. Today, however, these things are quite well known, so that one must proceed carefully with everyday dream material out of consideration for a public educated in these matters. It is a special inconvenience that no dream can be recounted without being obliged to add to it half a life's history, which affords the individual foundations of the dream. But there are some few typical dreams which can be told without too great a ballast. One of these is the dream of the sexual assault, which is especially prevalent among women. A girl, sleeping after an evening happily spent in dancing, dreams that a robber breaks open her door noisily and stabs through her body with a lance. This theme, which explains itself, has countless variations, some simple, some complicated. Instead of the lance, it is a sword, a dagger, a revolver, a gun, a cannon, a hydrant, a watering pot. Or the assault is a burglary, a pursuit, a robbery, or it is someone hidden in the closet or under the bed. Or the danger may be illustrated by wild animals, for instance a horse which throws the dreamer to the ground and kicks her in the body with his hind foot, lions, tigers, elephants with threatening trunks, and finally snakes in endless variety. Sometimes the snake creeps into the mouth, sometimes it bites the breast like Cleopatra's legendary asp, sometimes it comes in the role of the paradisical snake, or in the variations of Franz Stuck, whose pictures of snakes bear the significant titles Vice, Sin, Lust. The mixture of lust and anxiety is expressed incomparably in the very atmosphere of these pictures, and far more brutally indeed than in Morica's charming poem, The Maiden's First Love Song. What's in the net? Behold, but I am afraid. Do I grasp a sweet eel? Do I seize a snake? Love is a blind fisherwoman. Tell the child where to seize. Already it leaps in my hands. O pity or delight! With nestlings and turnings it coils on my breast. It bites me, oh wonder! Boldly through the skin it darts under my heart. Oh love, I shudder. What can I do? What can I begin? That shuddering thing, there it crackles within and coils in a ring. It must be poisoned. Here it crawls around. Blissfully I feel as it worms itself into my soul and kills me, finally. All these things are simple and need no explanation to be intelligible. Somewhat more complicated, but still unmistakable, is the dream of a woman. She sees the triumphal arch of Constantine. A cannon stands before it. To the right of it, a bird. To the left, a man. A shot flashes out of the tube. The projectile hits her. It goes into her pocket, into her purse. There it remains, and she holds her purse as if something very precious were in it. The image disappears, and she continues to see only the stock of the cannon, and over that Constantine's motto, In hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. These few references to the symbolic nature of dreams are perhaps sufficient. For whomsoever the proof may appear insufficient, and it is certainly insufficient for a beginner, further evidence may be found in the fundamental work of Freud, and in the works of Stekel and Rank, which are fuller in certain particulars. We must assume here that the dream symbolism is an established fact, in order to bring to our study a mind suitably prepared for an appreciation of this work. We would not be successful if we, on the contrary, were to be astonished at the idea that an intellectual image can be projected into our conscious psychic activity, an image which apparently obeys such wholly other laws and purposes than those governing the conscious psychic product. Why are dreams symbolic? Every why in psychology is divided into two separate questions. First, for what purpose are dreams symbolic? We will answer this question only to abandon it at once. Dreams are symbolic in order that they cannot be understood, in order that the wish, which is the source of the dream, may remain unknown. The question why this is so and not otherwise leads us out into the far-reaching experiences and trains of thought of the Freudian psychology. Here, the second question interests us, namely, how is it that dreams are symbolic? That is to say, from where does this capacity for symbolic representation come, of which we in our conscious daily life can discover apparently no traces? Let us examine this more closely. Can we really discover nothing symbolic in our everyday thought? Let us follow our trains of thought. Let us take an example. We think of the War of 1870 and 1871. We think about a series of bloody battles, the Siege of Strasbourg, Belfort, Paris, the Treaty of Peace, the foundation of the German Empire, and so on. How have we been thinking? We start with an idea, or super idea, as it is also called, and without thinking of it, but each time merely guided by a feeling of direction, we think about individual reminiscences of the war. In this we can find nothing symbolic, and our whole conscious thinking proceeds according to this type. If we observe our thinking very narrowly and follow an intensive train of thought, as for example the solution of a difficult problem, then suddenly we notice that we are thinking in words, that in wholly intensive thinking we begin to speak to ourselves, or that we occasionally write down the problem, or make a drawing of it so as to be absolutely clear. It must certainly have happened to anyone who has lived for some time in a foreign country that, after a certain period, he has begun to think in the language of the country. A very intensive train of thinking works itself out more or less in word form. That is, if one wants to express it, to teach it, or to convince anyone of it. Evidently, it directs itself wholly to the outside world. To this extent, this directed or logical thinking is a reality thinking, having a real existence for us, that is to say, a thinking which adjusts itself to actual conditions. Footnote: the moment of adaptation is emphasized especially by William James in his definition of reasoning. Let us make this ability to deal with novel data the technical differentia of reasoning. This will sufficiently mark it out from common associative thinking and will immediately enable us to say just what peculiarity it contains. End of footnote. Where we, expressed in other words, imitate the succession of objectively real things, so that the images in our mind follow after each other in the same strictly causal succession as the historical events outside of our mind. Footnote: thoughts are shadows of our experiences, always darker, emptier, simpler than these, says Nietzsche. Lotzer, in Logik, expresses himself in regard to this as follows: thought, left to the logical laws of its movement, encounters once more at the end of its regularly traversed course the things suppressed or hidden. End of footnote. We call this thinking with directed attention. It has, in addition, the peculiarity that one is tired by it, and that on this account it is set into action only for a time. Our whole vital accomplishment, which is so expensive, is adaptation to environment. A part of it is the directed thinking, which, biologically expressed, is nothing but a process of psychic assimilation, which, as in every vital accomplishment, leaves behind a corresponding exhaustion. The material with which we think is language and speech concept, a thing which has been used from time immemorial as something external, a bridge for thought, and which has a single purpose, that of communication. As long as we think directedly, we think for others and speak to others. Speech is originally a system of emotional and imitative sounds, sounds which express terror, fear, anger, love, and sounds which imitate the noises of the elements, the rushing and gurgling of water, the rolling of thunder, the tumults of the winds, the tones of the animal world, and so on. And finally those which represent a combination of the sounds of perception and of affective reaction. Likewise, in the more or less modern languages, large quantities of onomatopoetic relics are retained. For example, sounds for the movement of water: rauschen, risseln, ruschen, rinnen, rennen, to rush, ruscello, ruisseau, river, Rhein, Wasser, wissen, wissern, pissen, piscis, fish. Thus, language is originally and essentially nothing but a system of signs or symbols, which denote real occurrences or their echo in the human soul. Therefore, one must decidedly agree with Anatole France when he says, "What is thought, and how do we think? We think with words." That alone is sensual and brings us back to nature. Think of it. The metaphysician has only the perfected cry of monkeys and dogs with which to construct the system of the world. That which he calls profound speculation and transcendent method is to put end to end, in an arbitrary order, the natural sounds which cry out hunger, fear, and love in the primitive forests, and to which were attached little by little the meanings which one believed to be abstract when they were only crude. Do not fear that the succession of small cries, feeble and stifled, which compose a book of philosophy, will teach us so much regarding the universe that we can live in it no longer. Thus is our directed thinking. And even if we were the loneliest and furthest removed from our fellows, this thinking is nothing but the first notes of a long drawn-out call to our companions that water had been found, that we had killed the bear, that a storm was approaching, or that wolves were prowling around the camp. A striking paradox of Abelard's, which expresses in a very intuitive way the whole human limitation of our complicated thinking process, reads, Sermo generator ab intellectu et general intellectum. Speech is generated by the intellect and in turn generates intellect. Any system of philosophy, no matter how abstract, represents in means and purpose nothing more than an extremely cleverly developed combination of original nature sounds. Footnote. It is difficult to calculate how great is the seductive influence of the primitive word meaning upon a thought. Anything which has even been in consciousness remains as an effective moment in the unconscious, says Hermann Paul. The old word meanings have an after effect, chiefly imperceptible, within the dark chamber of the unconscious in the soul, adds Paul. J.G. Hamann expresses himself unequivocally. Metaphysics reduces all catchwords and all figures of speech of our empirical knowledge to empty hieroglyphics and types of ideal relations. It is said that Kant learned some things from Hamann. End of footnote. Hence arises the desire of a Schopenhauer or a Nietzsche for recognition and understanding, and the despair and bitterness of their loneliness. One might expect, perhaps, that a man full of genius could pasture in the greatness of his own thoughts, and renounce the cheap approbation of the crowd, which he despises. Yet he succumbs to the more powerful impulse of the herd instinct. His searching and his finding, his call, belong to the herd. When I said just now that directed thinking is properly a thinking with words, and quoted that clever testimony of Anatole France as drastic proof of it, a misunderstanding might easily arise, namely that directed thinking is really only word. That certainly would go too far. Language should, however, be comprehended in a wider sense than that of speech, which is in itself only the expression of the formulated thought, which is capable of being communicated in the widest sense. Otherwise, the deaf-mute would be limited to the utmost in his capacity for thinking, which is not the case in reality. Without any knowledge of the spoken word, he has his language. This language, considered from the standpoint of history, or in other words, directed thinking, is here a descendant of the primitive words, as for instance Wundt expresses it. A further important result of that cooperation of sound and sign interchange consists in the fact that very many words gradually lose altogether their original concrete thought meaning and turn into signs for general ideas and for the expression of the apperceptive functions of relation and comparison and their products. In this manner, abstract thought develops, which, because it would not be possible without the change of meaning lying at the root of it, is indeed a production of that psychic and psychophysical reciprocal action out of which the development of language takes place. Jodl denies the identity of language and thought because, for one reason, one and the same psychic fact might be expressed in different languages in different ways. From that he draws the conclusion that a super-language thinking exists. Certainly there is such a thing, whether with Erdmann one considers it hypologisch, or with Jodl as superlanguage. Only this is not logical thinking. My conception of it agrees with the noteworthy contribution made by Baldwin in Thought and Things or Genetic Logic, which I will quote here word for word. The transmission from pre-judgmental to judgmental meaning is just that, from knowledge which has social confirmation to that which gets along without it. The meanings utilized for judgment are those already developed in their presuppositions and applications through the confirmation of social intercourse. Thus, the personal judgment, trained in the methods of social rendering and disciplined by the interaction of its social world, projects its content into that world again. In other words, the platform for all movement into the assertion of individual judgment, the level from which new experience is utilized, is already and always socialized, and it is just this movement that we find reflected in the actual results as the sense of the appropriateness or synonymic character of the meaning rendered. Now, the development of thought, as we are to see in more detail, is by a method essentially of trial and error, of experimentation, of the use of meanings as worth more than they are as yet recognized to be worth. The individual must use his own thoughts, his established knowledges, his grounded judgments for the embodiment of his new inventive constructions. He erects his thought, as we say, schematically, in logic terms, problematically, conditionally, disjunctively, projecting into the world an opinion still peculiar to himself, as if it were true. Thus, all discovery proceeds. But this is, from the linguistic point of view, still to use the current language, still to work by meanings already embodied in social and conventional usage. Language grows, therefore, just as thought does, by never losing its synonymic or dual reference. Its meaning is both personal and social. It is the register of tradition, the record of racial conquest, the deposit of all the gains made by the genius of individuals. The social copy system thus established reflects the judgmental processes of the race, and in turn becomes the training school of the judgment of new generations. Baldwin continues, most of the training of the self, whereby the vagaries of personal reaction to fact and image are reduced to the basis of sound judgment, comes through the use of speech. When the child speaks, he lays before the world his suggestion for a general or common meaning. The reception he gets confirms or refutes him. In either case, he is instructed. His next venture is now from a platform of knowledge on which the newer item is more nearly convertible into the common coin of effective intercourse. The point to notice here is not so much the exact mechanism of the exchange secondary conversion by which this gain is made, as the training in judgment that the constant use of it affords. In each case, effective judgment is the common judgment. Here, the object is to point out that it is secured by the development of a function whose rise is directly ad hoc, directly for the social experimentation by which growth in personal competence is advanced as well, the function of speech. In language, therefore, to sum up the foregoing, we have the tangible, the actual, the historical instrument of the development and conservation of psychic meaning. It is the material evidence and proof of the concurrence of social and personal judgment. In it, synonymic meaning, judged as appropriate, becomes social meaning, held as socially generalized and acknowledged. These arguments of Baldwin abundantly emphasize the wide-reaching limitations of thinking caused by language. These limitations are of the greatest significance, both subjectively and objectively. At least their meaning is great enough to force one to ask oneself if, after all, in regard to independence of thought, Franz Mautner, thoroughly skeptical, is not really correct in his view that thinking is speech and nothing more. Baldwin expresses himself more cautiously and reservedly. Nevertheless, his inner meaning is plainly in favor of the primacy of speech. Naturally, not in the sense of the spoken word. The directed thinking, or as we might perhaps call it, the thinking in internal speech, is the manifest instrument of culture. And we do not go astray when we say that the powerful work of education which the centuries have given to directed thinking has produced, just through the peculiar development of thinking from the individual subjective into the social objective, a practical application of the human mind to which we owe modern empiricism and technique, and which occurs for absolutely the first time in the history of the world. Inquisitive minds have often tormented themselves with the question why the undoubtedly extraordinary knowledge of mathematics and principles and material facts, united with the unexampled art of the human hand in antiquity, never arrived at the point of developing those known technical statements of fact, for instance, the principles of simple machines, beyond the realm of the amusing and curious to a real technique in the modern sense. There is necessarily only one answer to this. The ancients, almost entirely, with the exception of a few extraordinary minds, lacked the capacity to allow their interest to follow the transformations of inanimate matter to the extent necessary for them to be able to reproduce the process of nature creatively and through their own art, by means of which alone they could have succeeded in putting themselves in possession of the force of nature. That which they lacked was training in directed thinking, or, to express it psychoanalytically, the ancients did not succeed in tearing loose the libido which might be sublimated from the other natural relations, and did not turn voluntarily to anthropomorphism. The secret of the development of culture lies in the mobility of the libido and in its capacity for transference. It is, therefore, to be assumed that the directed thinking of our time is a more or less modern acquisition which was lacking in earlier times. But with that, we come to a further question, namely, what happens if we do not think directedly? Then our thinking lacks the major idea and the feeling of direction which emanates from that. Footnote. So at least this form of thought appears to consciousness. Freud says in this connection, in the interpretation of dreams, it is demonstrably incorrect to state that we abandon ourselves to an aimless course of ideas when we relinquish our reflections and allow the unwilled ideas to emerge. It can be shown that we are able to reject only those end presentations known to us, and that immediately upon the cessation of these unknown, or as we inaccurately say, unconscious end presentations come into play, which now determine the course of the unwilled ideas. A thought without end presentation cannot be produced through any influence we can exert on our own psychic life. End of footnote. We no longer compel our thoughts along a definite track, but let them float, sink, and mount according to their own gravity. According to Kulpe, thinking is a kind of inner will action, the absence of which necessarily leads to an automatic play of ideas. James understands the non-directed thinking, or merely associative thinking, as the ordinary one. He expresses himself about that in the following manner. Our thought consists for the great part of a series of images, one of which produces the other, a sort of passive dream state of which the higher animals are also capable. This sort of thinking leads nevertheless to reasonable conclusions of a practical as well as of a theoretical nature. As a rule, the links of this sort of irresponsible thinking, which are accidentally bound together, are empirically concrete things, not abstractions. We can, in the following manner, complete these definitions of William James. This sort of thinking does not tire us. It quickly leads us away from reality into fantasies of the past and future. Here, thinking in the form of speech ceases. Image crowds upon image, feeling upon feeling. More and more clearly one sees a tendency which creates and makes believe, not as it truly is, but as one indeed might wish it to be. The material of these thoughts which turns away from reality can naturally be only the past with its 1,000 memory pictures. The customary speech calls this kind of thinking dreaming. Whoever attentively observes himself will find the general custom of speech very striking, for almost every day we can see for ourselves how, when falling asleep, fantasies are woven into our dreams so that between the dreams of day and night there is not so great a difference. Thus we have two forms of thinking, directed thinking and dream or fantasy thinking. The first, working for communication with speech elements, is troublesome and exhausting. The latter, on the contrary, goes on without trouble, working spontaneously, so to speak, with reminiscences. The first creates innovations, adaptations, imitates reality and seeks to act upon it. The latter, on the contrary, turns away from reality, sets free subjective wishes, and is, in regard to adaptation, wholly unproductive. Let us leave aside the query as to why we possess these two different ways of thinking and turn back to the second proposition. Namely, how comes it that we have two different ways of thinking? I have intimated above is at present. In this age, the most beautiful expression of directed thinking is science, and the technique fostered by it. Both things are indebted for their existence simply to an energetic education in directed thinking. At the time, however, when a few forerunners of the present culture, like the poet Petrarch, first began to appreciate nature understandingly, there was already in existence an equivalent for our science, to wit, scholasticism. This took its objects from the fantasies of the past, and it gave to the mind a dialectic training in directed thinking. The only success which beckoned the thinker was rhetorical victory in disputation, and not a visible transformation of reality. The subjects of thinking were often astonishingly fantastical. For example, questions were discussed, such as how many angels could have a place on the point of a needle, whether Christ could have done his work of redemption equally well if he had come into the world as a pea. The possibility of such problems, to which belong the metaphysical problems in general, namely to be able to know the unknowable, shows us of what peculiar kind that mind must have been which created such things, which to us are the height of absurdity. Nietzsche had guessed, however, at the biological background of this phenomenon when he spoke of the beautiful tension of the Germanic mind which the Middle Ages created. Taken historically, scholasticism, in the spirit of which persons of towering intellectual powers, such as Thomas of Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Abelard, William of Ockham, and others, have labored, is the mother of the modern scientific attitude, and a later time will see clearly how and in what scholasticism still furnishes living undercurrents to the science of today. Its whole nature lies in dialectic gymnastics, which have raised the symbol of speech, the word, to an almost absolute meaning, so that it finally attained to that substantiality which expiring antiquity could lend to its logos only temporarily, through attributes of mystical valuation. The great work of scholasticism, however, appears to be the foundation of firmly knitted intellectual sublimation, the conditio sine qua non of the modern scientific and technical spirit. Should we go further back into history, we shall find that which today we call science dissolved into an indistinct cloud. The modern culture-creating mind is incessantly occupied in stripping off all subjectivity from experience, and in finding those formulas which bring nature and her forces to the best and most fitting expression. It would be an absurd and entirely unjustified self-glorification if we were to assume that we are more energetic or more intelligent than the ancients. Our materials for knowledge have increased, but not our intellectual capacity. For this reason, we become immediately as obstinate and insusceptible in regard to new ideas as people in the darkest times of antiquity. Our knowledge has increased, but not our wisdom. The main point of our interest is displaced wholly into material reality. Antiquity preferred a mode of thought which was more closely related to a fantastic type, except for a sensitive perspicuity towards works of art, not attained since then. We seek in vain in antiquity for that precise and concrete manner of thinking characteristic of modern science. We see the antique spirit create not science, but mythology. Unfortunately, we acquire in school only a very paltry conception of the richness and immense power of life of Grecian mythology. Therefore, at first glance, it does not seem possible for us to assume that energy and interest which today we put into science and technique, the man of antiquity gave in great part to his mythology. That, nevertheless, gives the explanation for the bewildering changes, the kaleidoscopic transformations and new syncretistic groupings, and the continued rejuvenation of the myths in the Grecian sphere of culture. Here we move in a world of fantasies, which, little concerned with the outer course of things, flows from an inner source and, constantly changing, creates now plastic, now shadowy shapes. This fantastical activity of the ancient mind created artistically par excellence. The object of the interest does not seem to have been to grasp hold of the how of the real world as objectively and exactly as possibly, but to aesthetically adapt subjective fantasies and expectations. There was very little place among ancient people for the coldness and disillusion which Giordano Bruno's thoughts on eternity and Kepler's discoveries brought to modern humanity. The naive man of antiquity saw in the sun the great father of the heaven and the earth, and in the moon the fruitful good mother. Everything had its demons. They animated equally a human being and his brother, the animal. Everything was considered according to its anthropomorphic or theriomorphic attributes, as human being or animal. Even the disk of the sun was given wings or 4 feet in order to illustrate its movement. Thus arose an idea of the universe which was not only very far from reality, but was one which corresponded wholly to subjective fantasies. We know from our own experience this state of mind. It is an infantile stage. To a child, the moon is a man or a face, or a shepherd of the stars. The clouds in the sky seem like little sheep. The dolls drink, eat, and sleep. The child places a letter at the window for the Christ child. He calls to the stork to bring him a little brother or sister. The cow is the wife of the horse, and the dog the husband of the cat. We know, too, that lower races, like the Negroes, look upon the locomotive as an animal and call the drawers of the table the child of the table. As we learn through Freud, the dream shows a similar type. Since the dream is unconcerned with the real condition of things, it brings the most heterogeneous matter together, and a world of impossibilities takes the place of realities. Freud finds progression characteristic of thinking when awake. That is to say, the advancement of the thought excitation from the system of the inner or outer perception through the endopsychic work of association, conscious and unconscious, to the motor end. That is to say, towards innervation. In the dream, he finds the reverse, namely regression of the thought excitation from the pre-conscious or unconscious to the system of perception, by the means of which the dream receives its ordinary impression of sensuous distinctness, which can rise to an almost hallucinating clearness. The dream thinking moves in a retrograde manner towards the raw material of memory. The structure of the dream thoughts is dissolved during the process of regression into its raw material. The reanimation of the original perception is, however, only one side of regression. The other side is regression to the infantile memory material, which might also be understood as regression to the original perception, but which deserves especial mention on account of its independent importance. This regression might indeed be considered as historical. The dream, according to this conception, might also be described as the substitute of the infantile scene, changed through transference into the recent scene. The infantile scene cannot carry through its revival. It must be satisfied with its return as a dream. From this conception of the historical side of regression, it follows, consequently, that the modes of conclusion of the dream, insofar as one may speak of them, must show at the same time an analogous and infantile character. This is truly the case, as experience has abundantly shown, so that today everyone who is familiar with the subject of dream analysis confirms Freud's proposition that dreams are a piece of the conquered life of the childish soul. Inasmuch as the childish psychic life is undeniably of an archaic type, this characteristic belongs to the dream in quite an unusual degree. Freud calls our attention to this especially. The dream, which fulfills its wishes by a short, regressive path, affords us only an example of the primary method of working of the psychic apparatus, which has been abandoned by us as unsuitable. That which once ruled in the waking state, when the psychical life was still young and impotent, appears to be banished to the dream life in somewhat the same way as the bow and arrow, those discarded primitive weapons of adult humanity, have been relegated to the nursery. Footnote: the concluding passage in Traumdeutung was of prophetic significance and has been brilliantly established since then through investigations of the psychoses. In the psychoses, these modes of operation of the psychic mechanism, normally suppressed in the waking state, again become operative, and then disclose their inability to satisfy our needs in the outer world. The importance of this position is emphasized by the views of Pierre Janet, developed independently of Freud, and which deserve to be mentioned here because they add confirmation from an entirely different side, namely the biological. Janet makes this distinction in this function of a firmly organized inferior and superior part, conceived of as in a state of continuous transformation. It is really on this superior part of the functions, on their adaptation to present circumstances, that the neuroses depend. The neuroses are the disturbances or the checks in the evolution of the functions, the illnesses depending upon the morbid functioning of the organism. These are characterized by an alteration in the superior part of the functions, in their evolution and in their adaptation to the present moment, to the present state of the exterior world and of the individual, and also by the absence or deterioration of the old parts of these same functions. In the place of these superior operations, there are developed physical, mental, and above all, emotional disturbances. This is only the tendency to replace the superior operations by an exaggeration of certain inferior operations, and especially by gross visceral disturbances, les névroses. The old parts are indeed the inferior parts of the functions, and these replace, in a purposeless fashion, the abortive attempts at adaptation. Briefly speaking, the archaic replaces the recent function which has failed. Similar views concerning the nature of neurotic symptoms are expressed by Claparède as well. He understands the hysterogenic mechanism as a tendance à la reversion, as a sort of atavistic manner of reaction. End of footnote. All this experience suggests to us that we draw a parallel between the fantastical, mythological thinking of antiquity and the similar thinking of children, between the lower human races and dreams. Footnote. I am indebted to Dr. Abraham for the following interesting communication. A little girl of 3.5 years had been presented with a little brother, who became the object of the well-known childish jealousy. Once she said to her mother, "You are two mammas. You are my mamma, and your breast is little brother's mamma." She had just been looking on with great interest at the process of nursing. It is very characteristic of the archaic thinking of the child for the breast to be designated as mamma. End of footnote. This train of thought is not a strange one for us, but quite familiar through our knowledge of comparative anatomy and the history of development, which show us how the structure and function of the human body are the results of a series of embryonic changes which correspond to similar changes in the history of the race. Therefore, the supposition is justified that ontogenesis corresponds in psychology to phylogenesis. Consequently, it would be true as well that the state of infantile thinking in the child's psychic life, as well as in dreams, is nothing but a re-echo of the prehistoric and the ancient. In regard to this, Nietzsche takes a very broad and remarkable standpoint in
adjectives, the
Human
difference between
or Too
ancient
Human.
and prehistoric is that
In
ancient
our
is
sleep
having lasted
and in
from
our
a remote
dreams,
period,
we
having
pass
been of long
through the
duration,
whole
of great
thought
age,
of earlier
very old,
humanity.
while prehistoric
I
is it
mean, in the
related to
same
the
way that
epoch
man
before written
reasons
record.
in his dreams, he reasoned when in the waking state many thousands of years. The first causa which occurred to his mind in reference to anything that needed explanation satisfied him and passed for truth. In the dream, this atavistic relic of humanity manifests its existence within us, for it is the foundation upon which the higher rational faculty developed, and which is still developing in every individual. The dream carries us back into earlier states of human culture, and affords us a means of understanding it better. The dream thought is so easy to us now because we are so thoroughly trained to it through the interminable stages of evolution during which this fantastic and facile form of theorizing has prevailed. To a certain extent, the dream is a restorative for the brain, which during the day is called upon to meet the severe demands for trained thought made by the conditions of a higher civilization. From these facts, we can understand how lately more acute logical thinking, the taking seriously of cause and effect, has been developed, when our functions of reason and intelligence still reach back involuntarily to those primitive forms of conclusion, and we live about half our lives in this condition. We have already seen that Freud, independently of Nietzsche, has reached a similar standpoint from the basis of dream analysis. The step from this established proposition to the perception of the myths as familiar dream images is no longer a great one. Freud has formulated this conclusion himself. The investigation of this folk psychologic formation, myths, etc., is by no means finished at present. To take an example of this, however, it is probable that the myths correspond to the distorted residue of wish fantasies of whole nations, the secularized dreams of young humanity. Rank understands the myths in a similar manner, as a mass dream of the people. Ricklin has insisted rightly upon the dream mechanism of the fables, and Abraham has done the same for the myths. He says, the myth is a fragment of the infantile soul life of the people, and thus the myth is a sustained, still remaining fragment from the infantile soul life of the people, and the dream is the myth of the individual. An unprejudiced reading of the above-mentioned authors will certainly allay all doubts concerning the intimate connection between dream psychology and myth psychology. The conclusion results almost from itself that the age which created the myths thought childishly, that is to say, fantastically, as in our age is still done to a very great extent, associatively or analogically, in dreams. The beginnings of myth formations in the child, the taking of fantasies for realities, which is partly in accord with the historical, may easily be discovered among children. One might raise the objection that the mythological inclinations of children are implanted by education. The objection is futile. Has humanity at all ever broken loose from the myths? Every man has eyes and all his senses to perceive that the world is dead, cold, and unending, and he has never yet seen a god nor brought to light the existence of such from empirical necessity. On the contrary, there was need of a fantastic, indestructible optimism, and one far removed from all sense of reality, in order, for example, to discover in the shameful death of Christ really the highest salvation and the redemption of the world. Thus one can indeed withhold from a child the substance of earlier myths, but not take from him the need for mythology. One can say that, should it happen that all traditions in the world were cut off with a single blow, then, with the succeeding generation, the whole mythology and history of religion would start over again. Only a few individuals succeed in throwing off mythology in a time of a certain intellectual supremacy. The mass never frees itself. Explanations are of no avail. They merely destroy a transitory form of manifestation, but not the creating impulse. Let us again take up our earlier train of thought. We spoke of the ontogenetic re-echo of the phylogenetic psychology among children. We saw that fantastic thinking is a characteristic of antiquity, of the child and of the lower races. But now we know also that our modern and adult man is given over in large part to this same fantastic thinking, which enters as soon as the directed thinking ceases. A lessening of the interest, a slight fatigue, is sufficient to put an end to the directed thinking, the exact psychological adaptation to the real world, and to replace it with fantasies. We digress from the theme and give way to our own trains of thought. If the slackening of the attention increases, then we lose, by degrees, the consciousness of the present, and the fantasy enters into possession of the field. Here, the important question obtrudes itself. How are fantasies created? From the poets, we learn much about it. From science, we learn little. The psychoanalytic method, presented to science by Freud, shed light upon this for the first time. It showed us that there are typical cycles. The stutterer imagines he is a great orator. The truth of this, Demosthenes, thanks to his energy, has proven. The poor man imagines himself to be a millionaire, the child an adult. The conquered fight out victorious battles with the conqueror. The unfit torments or delights himself with ambitious plans. We imagine that which we lack. The interesting question of the why of all this, we must here leave unanswered while we return to the historic problem. From what source do the fantasies draw their materials? We choose as an example a typical fantasy of puberty, a child in that stage before whom the whole frightening uncertainty of the future fate opens, puts back the uncertainty into the past through his fantasy and says, if only I were not the child of my ordinary parents, but the child of a rich and fashionable count, and had been merely passed over to my parents. Then someday a golden coach would come, and the count would take his child back with him to his wonderful castle. And so it goes on, as in Grimm's fairy tales, which the mother tells to her children. With a normal child, it stops with the fugitive, quickly passing idea, which is soon covered over and forgotten. However, at one time, and that was in the ancient world of culture, the fantasy was an openly acknowledged institution. The heroes, I recall, Romulus and Remus, Semiramis, Moses, and many others, have been separated from their real parents. Others are directly sons of gods, and the noble races derive their family trees from heroes and gods. As one sees by this example, the fantasy of modern humanity is nothing but a re-echo of an old folk belief, which was very widespread originally. This ambitious fantasy chooses, among others, a form which is classic, and which once had a true meaning. The same thing holds good in regard to the sexual fantasy. In the preamble, we have spoken of dreams of sexual assault, the robber who breaks into the house and commits a dangerous act. That, too, is a mythological theme, and in the prehistoric era was certainly a reality, too. Footnote: the Dioscuri married the Leucipides by theft, an act which, according to the ideas of higher antiquity, belonged to the necessary customs of marriage. End of footnote. Wholly apart from the fact that the capture of women was something general in the lawless prehistoric times, it was also a subject of mythology in cultivated epochs. I recall the capture of Proserpina, Deianira, Europa, the Sabine women, etc. We must not forget that even today marriage customs exist in various regions which recall the ancient custom of marriage by capture. The symbolism of the instrument of coitus was an inexhaustible material for ancient fantasy. It furnished a widespread cult that was designated phallic, the object of reverence of which was the phallus. The companion of Dionysus was Thales, a personification of the phallus proceeding from the phallic Herme of Dionysus. The phallic symbols were countless. Among the Sabines, the custom existed for the bridegroom to part the bride's hair with a lance. The bird, the fish, and the snake were phallic symbols. In addition, there existed in enormous quantities theriomorphic representations of the sexual instinct, in connection with which the bull, the he-goat, the ram, the boar, and the ass were frequently used. An undercurrent to this choice of symbol was furnished by the sodomitic inclination of humanity, when in the dream fantasy of modern man, the feared man is replaced by an animal. There is recurring in the ontogenetic re-echo the same thing which was openly represented by the ancients countless times. There were he-goats which pursued nymphs, satyrs with she-goats. In still older times in Egypt, there even existed a shrine of a goat god which the Greeks called Pan, where the hierodules prostituted themselves with goats. It is well known that this worship has not died out but continues to live as a special custom in South Italy and Greece. Footnote: compare also the sodomitic fantasies in the Metamorphoses of Apuleius. In Herculaneum, for example, corresponding sculptures have been found. End of footnote. Today, we feel for such a thing nothing but the deepest abhorrence, and never would admit it still slumbered in our souls. Nevertheless, just as truly as the idea of the sexual assault is there, so are these things there too, which we should contemplate still more closely, not through moral eyeglasses with horror, but with interest as a natural science, since these things are venerable relics of past culture periods. We have even today a clause in our penal code against sodomy, but that which was once so strong as to give rise to a worship among a highly developed people has probably not wholly disappeared from the human soul during the course of a few generations. We may not forget that since the Symposium of Plato, in which homosexuality faces us on the same level with the so-called normal sexuality, only 80 generations have passed. And what are 80 generations? They shrink to an imperceptible period of time when compared with the space of time which separates us from the Homo neanderthalensis or heidelbergensis. I might call to mind in this connection some choice thoughts of the great historian Guglielmo Ferrero. It is a very common belief that the further man is separated from the present by time, the more does he differ from us in his thoughts and feelings, that the psychology of humanity changes from century to century, like fashions of literature. Therefore, no sooner do we find in past history an institution, a custom, a law, or a belief a little different from those with which we are familiar, than we immediately search for some complex meanings, which frequently resolve themselves into phrases of doubtful significance. Indeed, man does not change so quickly. His psychology at bottom remains the same, and even if his culture varies much from one epoch to another, it does not change the functioning of his mind. The fundamental laws of the mind remain the same, at least during the short historical period. During the short historical period of which we have knowledge, and all phenomena, even the most strange, must be capable of explanation by those common laws of the mind which we can recognize in ourselves. The psychologist should accept this viewpoint without reservation as peculiarly applicable to himself. Today, indeed, in our civilization, the phallic processions, the Dionysian mysteries of classical Athens, the bare-faced phallic emblems have disappeared from our coins, houses, temples, and streets. So also have the theriomorphic representations of the deity been reduced to small remnants, like the dove of the Holy Ghost, the Lamb of God and the Cock of Peter adorning our church towers. In the same way, the capture and violation of women have shrunken away to crimes. Yet all of this does not affect the fact that we, in childhood, go through a period in which the impulses towards these archaic inclinations appear again and again, and that through all our life we possess, side by side with the newly recruited, directed, and adapted thought, a fantastic thought which corresponds to the thought of the centuries of antiquity and barbarism. Just as our bodies still keep the reminders of old functions and conditions in many old-fashioned organs, so our minds too, which apparently have outgrown those archaic tendencies, nevertheless bear the marks of the evolution passed through, and the very ancient re-echoes, at least dreamily, in fantasies. The symbolism which Freud has discovered is revealed as an expression of a thinking and of an impulse limited to the dream, to wrong conduct and to derangements of the mind, which form of thinking and impulse at one time ruled as the mightiest influence in past culture epochs. The question of whence comes the inclination and ability which enables the mind to express itself symbolically brings us to the distinction between the two kinds of thinking, the directed and adapted on one hand, and the subjective, fed by our own egotistic wishes on the other. The latter form of thinking, presupposing that it were not constantly corrected by the adapted thinking, must necessarily produce an overwhelmingly subjectively distorted idea of the world. We regard this state of mind as infantile. It lies in our individual past and in the past of mankind. With this, we affirm the important fact that man, in his fantastic thinking, has kept a condensation of the psychic history of his development, an extraordinarily important task, which even today is hardly possible, is to give a systematic description of fantastic thinking. One may, at the most, sketch it. While directed thinking is a phenomenon conscious throughout, the same cannot be asserted of fantastic thinking. Doubtless a great part of it still falls entirely in the realm of the conscious, but at least just as much goes along in half-shadows, and generally an undetermined amount in the unconscious, and this can therefore be disclosed only indirectly. By means of fantastic thinking, directed thinking is connected with the oldest foundations of the human mind, which have been for a long time beneath the threshold of the consciousness. The products of this fantastic thinking arising directly from the consciousness are first waking dreams or daydreams, to which Freud, Flournoy-Pick and others have given special attention. Then the dreams which offer to the consciousness, at first, a mysterious exterior and win meaning only through the indirectly inferred unconscious contents. Lastly, there is a so-called wholly unconscious fantasy system in the split-off complex, which exhibits a pronounced tendency towards the production of a dissociated personality. Our foregoing explanations show wherein the products arising from the unconscious are related to the mythical. From all these signs, it may be concluded that the soul possesses, in some degree, historical strata, the oldest stratum of which would correspond to the unconscious. The result of that must be that an introversion occurring in later life, according to the Freudian teaching, seizes upon regressive, infantile reminiscences taken from the individual past. That first points out the way. Then, with stronger introversion and regression, strong repressions, introversion psychoses, there come to light pronounced traits of an archaic mental kind which, under certain circumstances, might go as far as the re-echo of a once manifest archaic mental product. This problem deserves to be more thoroughly discussed. As a concrete example, let us take the history of the pious Abbé Auguerre, which Anatole France has communicated to us. This priest was a hypercritical man, and much given to fantasies, especially in regard to one question, namely the fate of Judas. Whether he was really damned, as the teaching of the Church asserts, to everlasting punishment, or whether God had pardoned him after all. Auguerre sided with the intelligent point of view that God, in his all-wisdom, had chosen Judas as an instrument in order to bring about the highest point of the work of redemption by Christ. This necessary instrument, without the help of which the human race would not have been a sharer in salvation, could not possibly be damned by the all-good God. In order to put an end to his doubts, Auguerre went one night to the church and made supplication for a sign that Judas was saved. Then he felt a heavenly touch upon his shoulder. Following this, Auguerre told the Archbishop of his resolution to go out into the world to preach God's unending mercy. Here we have a richly developed fantasy system before us. It is concerned with the subtle and perpetually undecided question as to whether the legendary figure of Judas is damned or not. The Judas legend is, in itself, mythical material, namely the malicious betrayal of a hero. I recall Siegfried and Hagen, Baldur and Loki. Siegfried and Baldur were murdered by a faithless traitor from among their closest associates. This myth is moving and tragic. It is not honorable battle which kills the noble, but evil treachery. It is, too, an occurrence which is historical over and over again. Over again. One thinks of Caesar and Brutus. Since the myth of such a deed is very old, and still the subject of teaching and repetition, it is the expression of a psychological fact that envy does not allow humanity to sleep, and that all of us carry, in a hidden recess of our heart, a deadly wish towards the hero. This rule can be applied generally to mythical tradition. It does not set forth any account of the old events, but rather acts in such a way that it always reveals a thought common to humanity, and once more rejuvenated. Thus, for example, the lives and deeds of the founders of old religions are the purest condensations of typical contemporaneous myths, behind which the individual figure entirely disappears. But why does our pious abbé torment himself with the old Judas legend? He first went into the world to preach the gospel of mercy, and then, after some time, he separated from the Catholic Church and became a Swedenborgian. Now we understand his Judas fantasy. He was the Judas who betrayed his Lord. Therefore, first of all, he had to make sure of the divine mercy in order to be Judas in peace. This case throws a light upon the mechanism of the fantasies in general. The known, conscious fantasy may be of mythical or other material. It is not to be taken seriously as such, for it has an indirect meaning. If we take it, however, as important per se, then the thing is not understandable and makes one despair of the efficiency of the mind. But we saw, in the case of Abbé Auguerre, that his doubts and his hopes did not turn upon the historical problem of Judas, but upon his own personality, which wished to win a way to freedom for itself through the solution of the Judas problem. The conscious fantasies tell us of mythical or other material, of undeveloped or no longer recognized wish tendencies in the soul. As is easily to be understood, an innate tendency, an acknowledgement of which one refuses to make, and which one treats as non-existent, can hardly contain a thing that may be in accord with our conscious character. It concerns the tendencies which are considered immoral and as generally impossible, and the strongest resentment is felt towards bringing them into the consciousness. What would Auguerre have said had he been told confidentially that he was preparing himself for the Judas role? And what in ourselves do we consider immoral and non-existent, or which we at least wish were non-existent? It is that which in antiquity lay widespread on the surface, namely sexuality in all its various manifestations. Therefore, we need not wonder in the least when we find this at the base of most of our fantasies, even if the fantasies have a different appearance. Because Auguerre found the damnation of Judas incompatible with God's goodness, he thought about the conflict in that way. That is the conscious sequence. Along with this is the unconscious sequence, because Auger himself wished to be a Judas. He first made sure of the goodness of God. To Auger, Judas was the symbol of his own unconscious tendency, and he made use of this symbol in order to be able to meditate over his unconscious wish. The direct coming into consciousness of the Judas wish would have been too painful for him. Thus, there must be typical myths, which are really the instruments of a folk psychological complex treatment. Jakob Burckhardt seems to have suspected this when he once said that every Greek of the classical era carried in himself a fragment of the Oedipus, just as every German carries a fragment of Faust. The problem, which the simple story of the Abbé Auger has brought clearly before us, confronts us again when we prepare to examine fantasies, which owe their existence this time to an exclusively unconscious work. We are indebted for the material which we will use in the following chapters to the useful publication of an American woman, Miss Frank Miller, who has given to the world some poetical, unconsciously formed fantasies under the title Quelques faits d'imagination créatrice subconsciente, Volume 5, Archives de Psychologie 1906. Footnote: I will not conceal the fact that for a time I was in doubt whether I dare venture to reveal through analysis the intimate personality which the author, with a certain unselfish scientific interest, has exposed to public view. Yet it seemed to me that the writer would possess an understanding deeper than any objections of my critics. There is also some risk when one exposes oneself to the world. The absence of any personal relation with Miss Miller permits me free speech, and also exempts me from those considerations due a woman which are prejudicial to conclusions. The person of the author is on that account just as shadowy to me as are her fantasies, and, like Odysseus, I have tried to let this phantom drink only enough blood to enable it to speak, and in so doing betray some of the secrets of the inner life. I have not undertaken this analysis, for which the author owes me but little thanks, for the pleasure of revealing private and intimate matters, with the accompanying embarrassment of publicity, but because I wish to show the secret of the individual as one common to all. End of footnote. Chapter 2. The Miller Fantasies. We know from much psychoanalytic experience that whenever one recounts his fantasies or his dreams, he deals not only with the most important and intimate of his problems, but with the one the most painful at that moment. Footnote: a very beautiful example of this is found in C.A. Bernoulli, Franz Overbeck, and Friedrich Nietzsche, Eine Freundschaft, 1908. This author depicts Nietzsche's behavior in Basel society. Once, at a dinner, he said to the young lady at his side, "I dreamed a short time ago that the skin of my hand, which lay before me on the table, suddenly became like glass, shiny and transparent, through which I saw distinctly the bones and the tissues and the play of the muscles. All at once I saw a toad sitting on my hand, and at the same time I felt an irresistible compulsion to swallow the beast. I overcame my terrible aversion and gulped it down." The young lady laughed. "And do you laugh at that?" Nietzsche asked, his deep eyes fixed on his companion, half questioning, half sorrowful. The young lady knew intuitively that she did not wholly understand, that an oracle had spoken to her in the form of an allegory, and that Nietzsche had revealed to her a glimpse into the dark abyss of his inner self. Bernoulli continues, "One can perhaps see, behind that harmless pleasure of faultless exactness in dress, a dread of contamination arising from some mysterious and tormenting disgust. Nietzsche went to Basel when he was very young. He was then just at the age when other young people are contemplating marriage. Seated next to a young woman, he tells her that something terrible and disgusting is taking place in his transparent hand, something which he must take completely into his body. We know what illness caused the premature ending of Nietzsche's life. It was precisely this which he would tell the young lady, and her laughter was indeed discordant." End of footnote. Since, in the case of Miss Miller, we have to do with a complicated system, we must give our attention carefully to the particulars which I will discuss, following as best I can Miss Miller's presentation. In the first chapter, Phénomène de suggestion passagère ou d'autosuggestion instantanée, Miss Miller gives a list of examples of her unusual suggestibility, which she herself considers as a symptom of her nervous temperament. For example, she is excessively fond of caviar, whereas some of her relatives loathe it. However, as soon as anyone expresses his loathing, she herself feels momentarily the same loathing. I do not need to emphasize especially the fact that such examples are very important in individual psychology. That caviar is a food for which nervous women frequently have an especial predilection is a fact well known to the psychoanalyst. Miss Miller has an extraordinary faculty for taking other people's feelings upon herself and of identification. For example, she identifies herself to such a degree in Cyrano with the wounded Christian de Neuvillette that she feels in her own breast a truly piercing pain at that place where Christian received the deadly blow. From the viewpoint of analytic psychology, the theatre, aside from any aesthetic value, may be considered as an institution for the treatment of the mass complex. The enjoyment of the comedy, or of the dramatic plot ending happily, is produced by an unreserved identification of one's own complexes with the play. The enjoyment of tragedy lies in the thrilling yet satisfactory feeling that something, which might occur to oneself, is happening to another. The sympathy of our author with the dying Christian means that there is in her a complex awaiting a similar solution, which whispers softly to her, Hodi tibi eras mihi, today you, tomorrow me. And that one may know exactly what is considered the effectual moment, Miss Miller adds that she felt a pain in her breast. Lorsque Sarah Bernhardt se précipite sur lui pour étancher le sang de sa blessure. When Sarah Bernhardt rushes over to quench the blood from her wound. Therefore, the effectual moment is when the love between Christian and Roxane comes to a sudden end. If we glance over the whole of Rostand's play, we come upon certain moments, the effect of which one cannot easily escape, and which we will emphasize here because they have meaning for all that follows. Cyrano de Bergerac, with the long, ugly nose, on account of which he undertakes countless duels, loves Roxane, who, for her part, unaware of it, loves Christian because of the beautiful verses, which really originate from Cyrano's pen, but which apparently come from Christian. Cyrano is the misunderstood one, whose passionate love and noble soul no one suspects. The hero, who sacrifices himself for others and, dying just in the evening of life, reads to her once more Christian's last letter, the verses which he himself had composed. Roxane, adieu. Je vais mourir. C'est pour ce soir, je crois, ma bien-aimée. J'ai l'âme lourde encore d'amour inexprimé. Roxane, adieu. I soon must die, this very night, beloved, and I feel my soul heavy with a love untold. I die, no more as in the days of old, my loving, longing eyes will feast on your least gesture. I, the least. I mind me of the way you touch your cheek, so softly with your finger as you speak. Ah me, I know that gesture well. My heart cries out. I cry, farewell. My life, my love, my jewel, my sweet. My heart was yours in every beat. Whereupon Roxane recognizes in him the real loved one. It is already too late. Death comes, and in agonized delirium, Cyrano raises himself and draws his sword. Why? I do believe he dares to mock my nose. Ha! Insolent! He raises his sword. What say you? It is useless? I know. But who fights ever hoping for success? I fought for lost cause and for fruitless quest. You there? Who are you? You are thousands? Ah, I know you now, old enemies of mine. Falsehood! He strikes the air with his sword. Have at you, ha! And compromise! Prejudice! Treachery! He strikes. Surrender I? Parley? No. Never. You too? Folly? You? I know that you will lay me low at last. Let be, yet I fall fighting, fighting still. You strip from me the laurel and the rose, take all. Despite you there is yet one thing I hold against you all. And when tonight I enter Christ's fair courts and lowly bowed sweep with doffed casque the heavens' threshold blue, one thing is left that, void of fold or stain, I bear away despite
Quelque chose
you.
que sans un pli, sans une tache, j'emporte malgré vous. Et c'est mon panache.
Cyrano, who under the hateful exterior of his body hid a soul so much more beautiful, is a yearner and one misunderstood, and his last triumph is that he departs at least with a clean shield. Sans un pli is sans une tache, without a fold, without a stain. The identification of the author with the dying Christian, who in himself is a figure but little impressive and sympathetic, expresses clearly that a sudden end is destined for her love, just as for Christian's love. The tragic intermezzo with Christian, however, is played, as we have seen, upon a background of much wider significance, namely the misunderstood love of Cyrano for Roxane. Therefore, the identification with Christian has only the significance of a substitute memory, Deckerinnerung, and is really intended for Cyrano. That this is just what we might expect will be seen in the further course of our analysis. Besides this story of identification with Christian, there follows, as a further example, an extraordinarily plastic memory of the sea, evoked by the sight of a photograph of a steamboat on the high seas. Je sentis les pulsations des machines, le soulèvement des vagues, le balancement du navire. I felt the pulsations of the machines, the rising of the waves, the swaying of the ship. We may mention here the supposition that there are connected with sea journeys particularly impressive and strong memories, which penetrate deeply into the soul and give an especially strong character to the surface memories through unconscious harmony. To what extent the memories assumed here agree with the above-mentioned problem, we shall see in the following pages. This example, following at this time, is singular. Once, while in bathing, Miss Miller wound a towel around her hair in order to protect it from a wetting. At the same moment, she had the following strong impression. Il me sembla que j'étais sur un piédestal, une véritable statue égyptienne avec tous ses détails, membres raides, un pied en avant, la main tenant des insignes. It seemed to me that I was on a pedestal, a real Egyptian statue, with all its details, stiff limbs, 1 foot in front, the hand holding badges, and so on. Miss Miller identified herself, therefore, with an Egyptian statue, and naturally the foundation for this was a subjective pretension. That is to say, I am like an Egyptian statue, just as stiff, wooden, sublime, and impassive, qualities for which the Egyptian statue is proverbial. One does not make such an assertion to oneself without an inner compulsion, and the correct formula might just as well be, as stiff, wooden, etc. as an Egyptian statue I might indeed be. The sight of one's own unclothed body in a bath has undeniable effects for the fantasy, which can be set at rest by the above formula. The example which follows this emphasizes the author's personal influence upon an artist. I succeeded in making him render landscapes like those of Lake Geneva, where he has never been, and he claimed that I could make him render things he had never seen, and given him the sensation of an ambient atmosphere he had never felt. In short, that I used him as he used his pencil, that is to say, as a simple instrument. This observation stands in abrupt contrast to the fantasy of the Egyptian statue. Miss Miller had here the unspoken need of emphasizing her almost magic effect upon another person. This could not have happened either without an unconscious need, which is particularly felt by one who does not often succeed in making an emotional impression upon a fellow being. With that, the list of examples which are to picture Miss Miller's auto-suggestibility and suggestive effect is exhausted. In this respect, the examples are neither especially striking nor interesting. From an analytical viewpoint, on the contrary, they are much more important, since they afford us a glance into the soul of the writer. Ferenczi has taught us in an excellent work what is to be thought about suggestibility, that is to say, that these phenomena win new aspects in the light of the Freudian libido theory. insomuch as their effects become clear through Libido-Besetzungen, libido occupations. This was already indicated above in the discussion of the examples, and in the greatest detail regarding the identification with Christian. The identification becomes effective by its receiving an influx of energy from the strongly accentuated thought and emotional feeling underlying the Christian motif. Just the reverse is the suggestive effect of the individual in an especial capacity for concentrating interest, that is to say, libido, upon another person, by which the other is unconsciously compelled to reaction, the same or opposed. The majority of the examples concern cases where Miss Miller is put under the effects of suggestion, that is to say, when the libido has spontaneously gained possession of certain impressions. And this is impossible if the libido is dammed up to an unusual degree by the lack of application to reality. Miss Miller's observations about suggestibility inform us, therefore, of the fact that the author is pleased to tell us, in her following fantasies, something of the history of her love. Chapter 3. The Hymn of Creation. The second chapter in Miss Miller's work is entitled Gloire à Dieu, Poème onirique. When 20 years of age, Miss Miller took a long journey through Europe. We leave the description of it to her. After a long and rough journey from New York to Stockholm, from there to Petersburg and Odessa, I found it a true pleasure to leave the world of inhabited cities and to enter the world of waves, sky, and silence. I stayed long hours on deck to dream, stretched out in a reclining chair. The histories, legends, and myths of the different countries which I saw in the distance came back to me indistinctly blended together in a sort of luminous mist, in which things lost their reality while the dreams and thoughts alone took on somewhat the appearance of reality. At first, I even avoided all company and kept to myself, lost wholly in my dreams, where all that I knew of great, beautiful, and good came back into my consciousness with new strength and new life. I also employed a great part of my time writing to my distant friends, reading and sketching out short poems about the regions visited. Some of these poems were of a very serious character. It may seem superfluous, perhaps, to enter intimately into all these details. If we recall, however, the remark made above that when people let their unconscious speak, they always tell us the most important things of their intimate selves, then even the smallest detail appears to have meaning. Valuable personalities invariably tell us, through their unconscious, things that are generally valuable, so that patient interest is rewarded. Miss Miller describes here a state of introversion. After the life of the cities, with their many impressions, had been absorbing her interest, with that already discussed strength of suggestion which powerfully enforced the impression, she breathed freely upon the ocean, and after so many external impressions became engrossed wholly in the internal, with intentional abstraction from the surroundings, so that things lost their reality and dreams became truth. We know from psychopathology that certain mental disturbances exist which are first manifested by the individuals shutting themselves off slowly, more and more from reality and sinking into their fantasies, during which process, in proportion as the reality loses its hold, the inner world gains in reality and determining power. This process leads to a certain point, which varies with the individual, when the patients suddenly become more or less conscious of their separation from reality. The event which then enters is the pathological excitation. That is to say, the patients begin to turn towards the environment with diseased views, to be sure, which, however, still represent the compensating, although unsuccessful, attempt at transference. The methods of reaction are naturally very different. I will not concern myself more closely about this here. This type appears to be generally a psychological rule, which holds good for all neuroses, and therefore also for the normal in a much less degree. We might therefore expect that Miss Miller, after this energetic and persevering introversion, which had even encroached for a time upon the feeling of reality, would succumb anew to an impression of the real world, and also to just as suggestive and energetic an influence as that of her dreams. Let us proceed with the narrative. But as the journey drew to an end, the ship's officers outdid themselves in kindness. Tout ce qu'il y a de plus en presse et de plus aimable. And I passed many amusing hours teaching them English. On the Sicilian coast, in the harbour of Catania, I wrote a sailor's song, which was very similar to a song well known on the sea, Brine, Wine and Damsels Fine. The Italians in general all sing very well, and one of the officers who sang on deck during night watch had made a great impression upon me, and had given me the idea of writing some words adapted to his melody. Soon after that, I was very nearly obliged to reverse the well-known saying, Veder Napoli e poi morir. That is to say, suddenly, I became very ill, although not dangerously so. I recovered to such an extent, however, that I could go on land to visit the sights of the city in a carriage. This day tired me very much, and since we had planned to see Pisa the following day, I went on board early in the evening and soon lay down to sleep without thinking of anything more serious than the beauty of the officers and the ugliness of the Italian beggars. One is somewhat disappointed at meeting here, instead of the expected impression of reality, rather a small intermezzo, a flirtation. Nevertheless, one of the officers, the singer, had made a great impression. Il m'avait fait beaucoup d'impression. The remark at the close of the description, sans songer à rien de plus sérieux que la beauté des officiers, and so on, diminishes the seriousness of the impression. It is true. The assumption, however, that the impression openly influenced the mood very much is supported by the fact that a poem upon a subject of such an erotic character came forth immediately. Brine, Wine and Damsels Fine, and in the singer's honour. One is only too easily inclined to take such an impression lightly, and one admits so gladly the statements of the participators when they represent everything as simple and not at all serious. I dwell upon this impression at length because it is important to know that an erotic impression after such an introversion has a deep effect and is undervalued, possibly by Miss Miller. The suddenly passing sickness is obscure and needs a psychologic interpretation, which cannot be touched upon here because of lack of data. The phenomena now to be described can only be explained as arising from a disturbance which reaches to the very depths of her being. From Naples to Livorno, the ship travelled for a night, during which I slept more or less well. My sleep, however, is seldom deep or dreamless. It seemed to me as if my mother's voice wakened me, just at the end of the following dream. At first, I had a vague conception of the words, "When the morning stars sang together," which were the preludium of a certain confused representation of creation and of the mighty chorals resounding through the universe. In spite of the strange, contradictory and confused character which is peculiar to the dream, there was mingled in it the chorus of an oratorio which has been given by one of the foremost musical societies of New York, and with that were also memories of Milton's Paradise Lost. Then, from out of this whirl, there slowly emerged certain words which arranged themselves into 3 strophes, and, indeed, they seemed to be in my own handwriting on ordinary blue-lined writing paper on a page of my old poetry book, which I always carried around with me. In short, they appeared to me exactly as some minutes later they were in reality in my book. Miss Miller now wrote down the following poem, which she rearranged somewhat a few months later to make it more nearly, in her opinion, like the dream original. When the Eternal first made sound, a myriad ears sprang out to hear, and throughout all the universe there rolled an echo deep and clear. All glory to the God of sound. When the Eternal first made light, a myriad eyes sprang out to look, and hearing ears and seeing eyes once more a mighty choral took. All glory to the God of light. When the Eternal first gave love, a myriad hearts sprang into life. Ears filled with music, eyes with light, pealed forth with hearts with love all rife. All glory to the God of love. Before we enter upon Miss Miller's attempt to bring to light, through her suppositions, the root of this subliminal creation, we will attempt a short analytic survey of the material already in our possession. The impression on the ship has already been properly emphasized, so that we need have no further difficulty in gaining possession of the dynamic process which brought about this poetical revelation. It was made clear in the preceding paragraphs that Miss Miller possibly had not inconsiderably undervalued the importance of the erotic impression. This assumption gains in probability through experience, which shows that, very generally, relatively weak erotic impressions are greatly undervalued. One can see this best in cases where those concerned, either from social or moral grounds, consider an erotic relation as something quite impossible. For example, parents and children, brothers and sisters, relations, homosexual between older and younger men, and so on. If the impression is relatively slight, then it does not exist at all.